It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky.
I could hear my mum screaming, and by then I just knew.
It just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Early in the morning of the 28th of August 1981, a commuter discovered the mutilated body of a young girl dumped by the Thames in Windsor. Unable to pinpoint exactly where she'd been killed meant that finding the killer was like looking for a needle in a haystack. All the police knew for certain was that they were looking for a violent and sadistic individual who took pleasure in inflicting pain, and that he was likely to do it again. Built on the banks of the River Thames in Berkshire is the town of Windsor. It's home to Windsor Castle, which has been an official residence of the British royal family for almost 1,000 years.
Windsor is a very, very busy town, very busy tourist town. However, the village of Windsor, the residence area of Windsor, is very local, just like any other village, and everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody else's business.
On a bright, sunny Friday morning in August 1981, Kenneth Linney of Thames Valley Police received a phone call, starting a case that would become a 30-year personal crusade.
I was at home and I received a call about 6:30 in the morning to say that a body had been found on the banks of the Thames in Windsor. I immediately attended.
When Detective Superintendent Linney reached the scene at 6:45, he was met by a horrific sight.
I arrived at Barry Avenue, where the body was in a face-down position, naked, that of a teenage girl, and it transpired that it was found by a man on his way to work. He immediately notified the police. I then made various phone calls and got other officers out to form an inquiry team, and the uniformed officers to seal the area off, and from there it went on into a general investigation.
There was no attempt to conceal the body, in fact, far from it. And one can only speculate as to the significance of this, but it could be that leaving the body in that condition to full public view might have been an additional twist to the humiliation of the victim.
Houseboats moored just meters from the body were immediately investigated.
All those boats were stopped from moving, and officers then started interviewing the occupants to see if they'd heard anything during the night.
By 7 a.m. they had ascertained that no one had heard anything, and Detective Superintendent Linney continued organising the investigation.
I notified then the Home Office pathologist. I then formulated a small incident room at Windsor Police Station until we had identified the body. It was very important to find out who this girl was. No girl had been reported missing in the Windsor area.
Almost 13 miles away near Hanwell in West London, mother of 3 Carol Walterton made a worrying discovery about her 17-year-old daughter Claire.
Went to wake her up and she wasn't in her bed, and it just wasn't right, so it fills you with a cold dread.
A worried Carol went to work, whilst in Windsor the police investigation continued.
It looked as if the body had been dropped from the sky due to the fact there was no blood or anything outside the basic body area. And bear in mind that there were severe wounds to the body. This was a problem for us, but we could find no forensic evidence as to where it was dropped from.
The forensic team then went about doing a procedure called taping.
Taping is done with sellotape to take any particles off the body. It's laid out then and sealed and used later on then for forensic report purposes.
In the early 80s, forensic scientists could only compare and match fibre samples. So until they found a comparison, the tapings were sent for storage. Then a preliminary investigation was carried out by the pathologist at the scene.
The wounds that were on the body could have been done in situ, where the body was found. But the body was definitely unconscious, if not lifeless, when it was laid on the footpath.
The pathologist found that Claire's throat had been cut and she'd been sadistically mutilated. It was too much, even for the most experienced of officers.
The injuries caused to the girl, horrific injuries that were caused to her, and how she must have suffered. And I think it affects you. I had four daughters, and I could see my teenage daughters in the same situation. So it does affect you.
It wasn't long before this horrendous and baffling murder made the national news.
I went to work and heard on the radio that they'd found somebody, her body, and I just knew it was her. I just knew it was her from where they found her in Windsor, which wasn't far from us. I don't know why, I just knew it was her, so I went into a complete panic. I phoned all the friends that I knew to see whether she was there. I phoned her work, and they were very cross that she just hadn't turned up. So I got home and went straight to the police station.
Once Claire had been reported missing, police quickly made the potential link.
The Metropolitan Police rang to say that a girl was missing from the Hanwell area. So we've notified them again, and officers came down and they identified the body.
Certain they had the right person, it was time for the police to tell the family and confirm Carol's worst fears.
Yes, it was her. After they looked at photos and things. And I can't even begin to describe what it was like after that.
Claire's older brother Nick arrived home, hoping his sister was still just missing.
After I heard it on the radio and everything else, and I made my way home, and that, as I was walking down the pavement, I could hear my mum screaming indoors. I could hear her screaming, and by then I just knew as well. And I think it was the police or someone that answered the door, and I think I just turned and said, "Is it?" or something, and they said, "Yeah."
Thames Valley police officers wasted no time looking into Claire's background.
I went up with another officer to Yedding Lane, to the family home, and there spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. They, of course, were in a terrible state, and I then again got officers to sit with them and left them to mourn their fate. It was a terrible shock, because the girl was used to going out during the day, and she was a local girl, and was well liked by everybody in the district.
On a council estate, there wasn't too much to do, but you have lots of friends, so she was always with friends, and, well, we always had a house full of friends. I think that was more her enjoyment. And also when she got her job, that became the be-all and end-all of her life, because she loved it so much and obviously loved the people there as well.
The next morning, the sun may have risen as usual, but for Claire's mum, Carol, the world as she knew it had ended.
All I can really remember is the house being full of policemen. It was just basically showing photos, and so really then we were dealing with it the next day when we knew it really was her, and been dealing with it ever since.
Whilst the family began a lifetime of grieving, the police continued with their investigation, determined to find Claire's vicious killer.
It was decided that an incident room, a major incident room, should be set up in the Metropolitan Police District.
Pete Byrne was a young policeman at that time.
I was involved in the investigation in that I was a young detective and was part of the 50-strong team of detectives that worked on the investigation.
The police's first job was to build up a picture of Claire and her final movements on that fateful Thursday night.
Claire was ironing and we said, "Are you going out tonight?" And she said, "No."
Me and Claire was just sitting in the kitchen having a chat, which was unusual really. We was having a good old chat and everything, and she weren't going out that night. And that, you know. But the funny thing was, I remember, God, we must be growing up because of the way we was talking to each other. But I don't know, she was staying in and that was it.
But when we got home, she had gone out. She was 17, it wasn't a problem. But she was always in by 10 o'clock or abouts. But I thought 17, okay, it's 11 o'clock, you know. It's always the first time. But then when she didn't come home, couldn't sleep at all because it just wasn't like her. She'd never been away all night unless we'd known about it. But then I heard laughing outside and I thought, oh, she's home. So I went off to sleep.
It didn't take long for police to piece together Claire's last night.
On the Thursday evening, Claire had gone to see her boyfriend who ran an amusement arcade on the Uxbridge Road at Ealing. She had left there around about 10 p.m. Normally, he would have given her a lift home, but they had a slight disagreement and she refused a lift. So she walked along the Uxbridge Road in the direction of her home in Northolt. Her boyfriend did attempt to get her into the car, stopped, asked her to get into the car, but she refused. That sighting of Claire being spoken to by her boyfriend is the last known sighting of Claire alive.
The boyfriend was immediately treated as a suspect.
He said he went home then by 10:30 that night, but he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Even though the police had been left with no clues, could they have already managed to find the murderer? In August 1981, 17-year-old Claire Walterton had been horrifically murdered and dumped in Windsor, and so far, no forensic evidence had been found. Police had quickly pieced together Claire's final movements, identifying the last person she was seen with, who was arrested for murder and questioned.
Inquiries in relation to his whereabouts later on that evening revealed that he had gone home and was seen by a neighbour walking a dog shortly afterwards, so therefore he was ruled out as being the potential attacker of Claire.
With their only suspect now eliminated, the police looked at using the power of publicity.
There was a lot of media activity, television and all, up at Hanwell. And of course the papers then had the large columns on it.
Information about Claire's last night was released by police to the press.
Two ladies came forward following publicity and said that they'd seen a girl dragged into a car at the junction of Uxbridge and Yedding Lane about roughly around the time that Claire was last seen. They couldn't give any descriptions. All they could say was a dark-coloured car.
Keen to get the most from their only lead, police weren't afraid to try experimental techniques.
I resorted to hypnotists actually interviewing some of these people because we felt that if you can probably refresh someone's memory by that means, then, of course, we may come up with something that the person doesn't think of normally.
Hypnotism didn't seem to have the desired effect.
Whether that person that the lady saw was Claire is unknown. A large part of the initial investigation centred on trying to identify that vehicle, but it was never traced.
The ladies were so vague about this. They thought a girl was pulled into a car. There was no screams, nothing whatsoever. And it was some distance away, they saw it. So there was no evidential value, really, in that particular incident.
Disappointed but undeterred, the investigation team continued with their inquiries.
The incident room then, once we established it at Norwood Green, became a very busy place because we had to do a lot of house-to-house inquiries from Hanwell down the Uxbridge Road right up to the top of Yedding Lane, which would have covered at the area where she would have walked. Then other inquiries had to be dealt with. You had inquiries, national inquiries, you had inquiries dealing with people with previous convictions for that type of offence or for sexual offences. So there was a lot of work to be done and a lot of foot slogging, to put it plainly.
For some on the team, this was all a new experience.
It was my first ever murder, and I was just learning how things are done on a major investigation in terms of the system. There was no computer as such, so everything was paper-based, but everything had to be done in a clear and methodical way so that nothing was missed.
There was a huge amount of work to be done.
The police inquiries, the witnesses, the incident room sometimes picks out something which is unusual from statements or movements or a person, the background of a person. And they have to be followed up, and they're known as actions. Actions are then dealt with by the detective officers who are out on the ground. It takes a long time. The average working hours during the day in an inquiry like that can be anything from 12 to 14 hours a day. Takes a lot of work.
After months of fruitlessly investigating every possible avenue, police were getting desperate.
Clairvoyants came forward. So many people came forward because it was a nasty murder. And the press gave it a lot of publicity.
With nothing to lose, a clairvoyant was introduced to Carol and the family.
She got in touch with them and they were clutching at straws. And she stayed for a couple of hours. But she kept saying things that Claire would have said, but Claire would never have spoken the way she was speaking, and she kept making out she was talking to her, which I found so upsetting, because if Claire was going to talk to anybody, she would have talked to me. Sorry. So, yeah, I had to ask her if she would go in the end, because she'd really overstayed her welcome.
In the spring of 1982, over 6 months after Claire Walterton's mutilated body was discovered in Windsor, the police still didn't have a single lead.
We tried everything, and with the result, of course, we didn't get anywhere. We had all our exhibits. They were put in storage in 1982. And then, as I say, I thought at that stage that we'll never solve the case unless, because of the sadistic injuries that were caused, were we dealing with a serial killer.
It was a horrible thought. Claire's killer probably wouldn't be caught unless they killed again.
This was someone who was really, really sadistic. And that was the type of person we were looking for.
The mutilation, the clearly sexual nature of the crime, suggests that there's a distinct possibility that the individual would strike again.
The failure to track down Claire's murderer was a big blow for everyone concerned.
You have to remember what things were like back in 1981. DNA as an investigative tool didn't exist. There was no CCTV. Mobile phones were very, very rare, and automatic number plate recognition didn't exist. However, you can only do what you can do, and if all the normal lines of inquiry haven't produced anything, then unfortunately you have to be pragmatic, and the investigation is wound down.
Well, it's disappointing that you like to get a result. You think of the girl lying on the pavement in Windsor, and it affects you. I don't care how hard anybody is, but it affects you. And it affected other officers at the time.
The chilling thought that Claire's killer would strike again never left the officers involved in the case. And in December 1984, Detective Superintendent Linney received the news he'd been expecting for over 2 years.
I had a phone call from officers over at Denham to say that they had found a body on the golf course. They told me that the body that they had was of a girl, naked and with horrific injuries. Now, I thought, well, this is identical. The modus operandi kicked in. The modus operandi is the method used by criminals, the same method that is used. And that is the base of serial killers. So here we are coming to the stage where the serial killer effect kicked in.
Now investigating 2 similar killings, Thames Valley Police were forced to wonder, had Claire's murderer struck again? Just over 3 years after the unsolved murder of Claire Walterton in Windsor, a mutilated body of a woman called Deirdre Sainsbury was found dumped at a golf course in Denham. It was a discovery that grabbed the police's attention. The body found on the golf course had chilling similarities to the murder of Claire Walterton.
As soon as I heard of this incident and the fact that it was identical more or less to the girl that was found in Windsor, Claire Walterton's name, of course, was there, printed all over it.
A murder investigation was immediately launched.
The police publicised the fact of the murder, and by chance, a man had seen Deirdre get into a vehicle on the South Circular Road in Richmond. That man had only recently read an article in the Reader's Digest which talked about the dangers of hitchhikers, and he had the presence of mind to recall the index number or registration number of the car that this hitchhiker had got into.
It was a huge piece of luck.
Police from the Denham inquiry, having received the registered owner of the vehicle, went to the house of Colin Campbell, who was the registered owner. They searched his property and found in the garage the clothing from the girl found on the golf course at Denham.
Police arrested and interviewed 37-year-old travelling salesman and keen amateur hockey player, Colin Campbell.
He admitted picking Deirdre up, stated that he chatted to her en route. In doing so, he gave his name, or his first name, and he felt, as he was getting on so well with her, he would try it on. He did. According to him, she retaliated and hit him, and then he hit her. But he stated he hit her so hard that she became unconscious. He stated he then panicked because he'd given his name to her, and in a panic, he then hit her about the head with a hockey stick, which is in the back of his car.
Campbell also admitted mutilating the body, allegedly to make it look like a maniac had done it. Convinced that there was a strong connection between Deirdre and Claire's killings, Detective Superintendent Linney went to see Campbell, hoping he might also confess to Claire's murder.
He was absolutely so suave, so complete, answered everything that I asked. Windsor? Oh yes, he'd been to Windsor. He'd been everywhere that I mentioned. But I had nothing whatsoever at that stage to connect him with Claire's murder. Nothing had been found at his property. And so I was left as I was in the beginning. And which was rather sad actually, because I thought that he might just break, but no.
It was disappointing, but the investigation into the brutal murder of Deirdre Sainsbury moved quickly.
Having been interviewed, admitted being responsible for Deirdre's death, he was charged with the murder and stood trial at Reading Crown Court. His plea in court was not guilty to murder. He stated that whilst responsible for Deirdre's death, he killed her whilst suffering an epileptic episode.
The jury chose not to believe an epileptic episode could explain this brutal and sexually motivated killing. In July 1985, just 6 months after her death, Campbell was convicted of Deirdre Sainsbury's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. But Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't satisfied.
It was too much of a coincidence that we had the modus operandi of a man who was sadistic when he dealt with Deirdre Sainsbury, and the same man, in my opinion, committed the murder of Claire Wolterton. I had to sit back and just wait and wait, because I felt this. He might talk later on. This happens. They sometimes do, if there's something on their mind.
Unaware of Kenneth Linney's theory, as the years went by, Claire's family tried to cope with the huge void that had been left in their lives.
I think about it all the time. Always remember birthdays. Christmases is very difficult because she was Christmas. Holidays were difficult. In fact, you spend a lot of time thinking that you shouldn't be doing holidays, Christmas and things like that, because it didn't feel right without her being there.
For me, Claire was Claire. I can't explain to you how that is. Claire was just a happy-go-lucky Claire.
Most memories I have are quite normal memories, because having a meal was just never having a meal. It was always laughing, having a meal at something that she'd either done or was doing while you were having the meal. So mostly when we sit down for dinner, I often remember some of the silly things she did. You know, she would either have peas up her nose or ice cream all over her face, or she would fill her mouth up with food and then laugh with her mouth open. It sounds awful, but when you're having a meal, it's actually quite funny.
Well, with my brother, it really affected him badly. He had a nervous breakdown and everything. So in the end, I didn't just lose a sister, I lost half of a brother as well, because he just weren't the same ever since.
In 1996, 15 years after his conviction for murdering Deirdre Sainsbury, Colin Campbell appealed.
He stated that whilst he was guilty of causing her death, it wasn't murder.
At the appeal, he put forward the same defence as his original trial, but this time with the backing of an expert, who stated that due to being on the wrong medication, an epileptic episode could have been to blame. Campbell's conviction was quashed, and in 1999, a retrial ordered.
At that retrial, Campbell proffered a plea to manslaughter, which was accepted by the Crown, and he was therefore convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment again, but with a minimum tariff of 1 day.
The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Gage, said that whilst the court accepted that at the time of the killing Campbell's responsibility had been diminished, he still constituted a danger to the public, so couldn't be released without going through a parole hearing. It wasn't the result he'd hoped for.
And at subsequent hearings before the parole board, it was deemed that he was too dangerous to be released.
As the years went by, Campbell remained in prison, but the unsolved murder of Claire Wolterton was never forgotten.
We didn't close the case completely, of course. You never do. We carried on taking inquiries and questions and answers from people, for other forces ringing up. This often happens, and you compare notes.
Police remained determined that they would bring Claire's murderer to justice. By 2011, the depraved murderer of Claire Walterton still hadn't been found, although police did have their suspicions about Colin Campbell, who was imprisoned for the strikingly similar 1984 killing of Deirdre Sainsbury. In 2007, Thames Valley Police had started looking at cold cases headed up by Pete Byrne. Claire's case was about to turn a corner.
In 2011, we had the capacity to commence a reinvestigation and a review into Claire's case. What we were looking to do was to use advancements in forensic science in the intervening 30 years to see if we could potentially identify the person responsible for her death.
What the review team found was to be key in moving the case forward.
One of the items that we submitted for additional forensic work was the tapings. These tapings had been originally taken to potentially obtain fibres. However, we knew from other cases that had been investigated by other forces within the UK that now you could get DNA that had been captured from those tapings.
The evidence was sent to LGC Forensics near Oxford for DNA analysis.
Tapes were examined microscopically and small sections were cut out and submitted for DNA profiling.
Pete Byrne contacted Kenneth Linney, who had retired, to tell him a cold case review was taking place.
Which I was delighted about, because I thought something might happen or come from that.
It didn't take long for the lab to come back with a result.
A mixed DNA profile was obtained which appeared to be from Claire Walterton and from an unknown male. We used that profile of the unknown male to search the National DNA Database, and this identified a list of potential contributors. Colin Campbell was amongst those individuals.
It was a name that was well known to everyone involved in the original 1981 case.
The moment I saw his name, I knew that he was a convicted killer. So I was obviously really, really excited.
The match to Campbell was strong, but it wasn't strong enough to guarantee a conviction.
At that point, they were able to say it was a 1 in a million match probability. And whilst that's good, normally for DNA, it's a 1 in a billion match probability.
A 1 in a million match probability meant that there could be up to 60 other individuals in the country who the DNA could belong to. 1 in a billion would mean it almost certainly came from Campbell.
So we needed additional forensic work to take place, which involved using a professor of genetic statistics from UCL College in London. That was going to take time, and also we were doing additional tests on other tapings that had been recovered from Claire's body.
In 2011, having been in prison for 26 years, Campbell was coming to the end of his sentence for what was now the manslaughter of Deirdre Sainsbury.
Campbell was a Category D prisoner, which meant he was allowed access out into the open, and obviously it was a potential danger to members of the public, the fact that this man potentially now was a double killer. So we had to make contact with the prison service, get him recategorised so that he was sent back to a closed prison.
Finally, after months of waiting, there was news from UCL College in London.
We had work completed by this professor of genetics who was able to say that the match probability, in his opinion, was 1 in a billion of Colin Campbell being the donor of the DNA found on the tapings.
The news meant that Kenneth Linney's original hunch in 1984 about Campbell had been right.
When I found out that Colin Campbell had been identified through DNA as being identical to a person's hair, his hair, which had been found on the tape taken at our mortuary, I was delighted.
On November the 27th, 2012, 31 years after Claire was killed, Colin Campbell was arrested. Police decided to question him.
Campbell showed no remorse whatsoever, and I got the impression that he felt that he was a victim, in as much that he had epilepsy, it had been wrongly diagnosed, he'd been given the wrong medication years ago, and it's other people's fault.
My lifestyle meant that the way I was, I wasn't averse to being friendly with the lady.
Yeah.
I may well have known a series of ladies.
Okay.
Claire may have been one of them. No, I don't. She looks like any girl I may have played hockey with. She looks like any girl I may have met through work.
Okay.
Actually, she looks like a happy person, and I'm glad about that. No, I don't recognise her.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's not to say I never ever knew her. I just don't remember her.
To my mind, had you committed that horrendous act against Claire, you would have known what you'd done and you'd remember it. But he was almost blasé about the fact, well, I can't remember what I was doing. We consulted with the Crown Prosecution Service. They agreed that Campbell should be charged. He was charged.
Once Campbell was charged, it was time to inform Claire's family.
Somebody described it as like a fresh scab that had been picked off. It was like an old wound that had been reopened, and that described it quite well for me.
On the 15th of November 2013, Colin Frederick Campbell stood trial at Reading Crown Court for the 1981 murder of Claire Walterton. Claire's mum, Carol, was there from the start.
It was very, very, very hard and very emotional and very upsetting.
Colin Campbell entered a plea of not guilty.
Campbell couldn't run the defence that the epilepsy was the cause of his actions which resulted in Claire's death. That was because the experts had given evidence for him in relation to Deirdre's death weren't happy to say that epilepsy could be responsible for two homicides.
Claire's mum, Carol, had her own way of dealing with the grisly details of the case.
I didn't stay in for all the nasty bits at all. But what I was in there for was quite difficult.
Claire's family had tremendous courage. Claire's mum wanted to come to court. She wanted to make sure that the man responsible for her daughter's death was convicted. But at the same time, and rightly so, she didn't want to know the full details of what happened to her daughter.
The prosecution called on their trump card, the DNA.
The key item was the DNA evidence. That's what brought the case to court in the first place. And when a DNA expert tells a jury this DNA is 1 billion times more likely to belong to Colin Campbell than anyone else, I think that was the key bit of information.
Faced with such compelling DNA evidence, Campbell put up his own defence.
He couldn't recall ever going into the amusement arcade where Claire had been that evening, but said he may have got in there, and had he gone in there, he may well have spoken to her, and he may well have touched her, and that's how his DNA got on her body. What was interesting was that the taping that from where the DNA was obtained was marked as being taken from Claire's buttocks, so therefore the fact that he was potentially saying it was innocent contact made that extremely unlikely.
The defence were, if I recall, trying to sort of blur the lines a little bit and discredit the DNA. But I think when you say it's 1 billion times, that's pretty damning.
At the beginning of December 2013, the judge sent the jury out to deliberate.
The jury took quite a long time for it to come out, to make up their mind, which was just a nightmare again. You don't realise how much that is chewing you up inside and how much tense you are. And that.
After 3 excruciating days, the jury came back, and Campbell was convicted of murder. A few days later, the sentence followed. The judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, stated that only Campbell would know the true circumstances in which he came to pick up Claire Walterton that Thursday night in 1981, but that he was certain he did it with the intention of sexually assaulting, mutilating, and ultimately killing her.
Colin Campbell was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Claire Walterton. He must serve a minimum of 24 years. By that time, he'll be 90 years of age.
For Claire's family, it was a bittersweet moment.
I started to get fed up with people going, oh, now you'll have closure. Because you don't have closure. She's still gone. She still went through something that was horrible. I mean, I really do say I am really pleased that they got him, but having it all raked up again was really difficult.
What he got and everything else weren't even long enough, as far as I'm concerned.
He took a beautiful life away. A beautiful life. Somebody who was just coming into being a girl, a woman. And that's just not fair. It's not fair.
Kenneth Linney, who had been involved from the very beginning, was there to hear it all.
The judge, of course, made it quite clear to him when he sentenced him that he wasn't going to get away with the epilepsy excuse that he gave before. They couldn't produce any witnesses to say that it was epilepsy. And the judge made a comment that if the Court of Appeal had known his background, he mightn't have had his sentence squashed. And it was nice to know that he was convicted and rightly sentenced to a long term. He will never be released from prison.
Although former Detective Superintendent Linney wasn't the only officer with a vested interest in the outcome.
Since 1981, Claire's case has been at the forefront of everyone's mind that worked on that case. When I got my current job, when I met old detectives that worked on Claire's case, they always asked me, what's happening with Claire's case? They were all extremely pleased when we got the result and Campbell was convicted. So much so that they held a reunion 6 months after the trial where they just wanted to meet up, talk about the case and just say well done, because it was all part of their life.
After 32 years of trying to solve this brutal and bewildering case, Kenneth Linney could be satisfied they'd got the right man.
Many more people would he have killed had he got away with the Denham case. Because if you get someone who starts that activity of killing young girls and causing horrific injuries on them, when do they stop? That's the question. And I believe that we did stop the makings of a serial killer.
Campbell was in his late 60s at the time of his conviction for Claire's brutal murder, which means it was unlikely he'd ever be released. Finally, Claire and Deirdre's families could feel that justice had been done.
The scenery is stunning, but the lies are getting uglier. Reese Witherspoon, Nicole Kidman and Laura Dern lead an all-star cast. Big Little Lies is new Friday at 9 on Sky Mix.
The news broke overnight.
It was brutal, you know, and it was in an area where you don't expect these sorts of things to happen.
The principal injuries were to her head. There were signs of multiple blows from a heavy object.
This is a sustained, violent assault.
Such a quiet, beautiful village. The fact that there was a murderer on the loose was really scary for people.
4,500 occupants of local homes in the area were questioned. She was well known, well liked, well loved. Very difficult to imagine anyone would target her.
As far as picture-perfect villages go, Bosham in West Sussex is up there with the best of them.
Bosham is a really picturesque, beautiful village. A lot of people from London have their second houses down here, so there's a lot of money down here as well.
It's predominantly a sailing village. A lot of sailing goes on in Bosham. People come from quite a way locally to go sailing in Bosham.
As a quaint coastal town, Bosham attracts its fair share of visitors.
A lot busier in the summer. Loads and loads of people come around to visit the area. But in this area, in the heart of the village, if you like, it's a pretty close-knit community, and people look out for each other, and it's just, it's just quite a typical sort of English village, I'd say.
The demographic is mainly of an elderly nature. There is the Chichester Harbour, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty, where a lot of the locals would go to sail, take lovely strolls and walks along the harbour. Especially in the summer months, it's more attractive for the tourists because of the lovely weather we get here in the south coast.
Crime is so low in Bosham, there are often months with nothing reported.
I remember being told by the police there hadn't been a crime recorded in Bosham for 6 months. So not a robbery, nothing, not a car broken into.
But in a village where everyone knows everyone, when the unthinkable happens, it tears a community apart.
Police are investigating after the body of a woman was found dead in a multi-million-pound property in a Hampshire village. The death is currently being treated as suspicious.
The news broke overnight that a woman was found in a home in Bosham.
The first that I knew that something had happened, there were multiple police cars and ambulances, which in Bosham it's unusual even to see one police car from week to week around the village, so that we obviously knew that something had happened, something had gone on.
At 10 a.m, 5 days after Christmas, Sussex police receive a 999 call to a large rural property in the village.
Police emergency, how can I help you?
The distraught caller reveals there's a woman dead in bed.
Obviously, the paramedics and police were called and they responded. They found a female in bed with clearly significant head injuries where she'd been struck numerous times with a blunt instrument.
The details from the police came in that the lady who had been found had been bludgeoned to death with an object. Her face was smashed in.
And it was clear at that point that this was a murder investigation.
It is quickly established the deceased woman is not the owner of the sumptuous property, as they are away for Christmas. So who is the woman? And who would want her dead?
There was a little bit of panic in the village because this sort of thing doesn't happen in Bosham.
It's such a quiet, beautiful village that the fact that there was a murderer on the loose was really scary for people.
Suddenly there was all this activity going on, lots and lots of police cars and everything. And of course, within no time, everybody knew there had been a murder. And there was a lot of gossiping and guesswork and so on.
As a journalist for the local newspaper at the time, Kelly Wickham was more used to reporting on village fates, but now found herself at the centre of a murder investigation.
Rumours started emerging about who could possibly have committed such a crime in this area. There were many speculations that came about, such as, why was the victim there? She didn't own the property. Where was the property owner?
A woman murdered while house-sitting a property in a seaside village has been named as Valerie Graves. Sussex police said that a post-mortem examination had not yet been carried out, but the woman is believed to have died of head injuries.
She just turned 55 on Christmas Day 2013, 4 days before her death. She originally was from London, had moved to Scotland to set up her home and a business up there, but returned down south to look after her elderly mother, Eileen, and spend more time with her family. She had 2 children, 2 grandchildren.
She had lived in Scotland for about 10 years, and she was a local artist up there.
Police soon established that Valerie was looking after the house over the festive period with her mum, her sister, and her sister's partner.
Things I would be considering en route to that particular crime scene would be who did find Valerie and under what circumstances? Who was the last person to see Valerie alive? Was there any sign of any struggle, any sign of any forced entry? If there's no sign of forced entry, then you may start thinking, well, was the premises insecure, or is this something that's occurred inside the family home? So was there a dispute that had taken place? So until you've kind of spoken to the family, you can't rule them out, but you can't rule them in as well.
With the identity of their victim now known, police need to establish who would want her dead. Investigators immediately look at the hours leading up to the discovery of her body.
The night of the 29th of December was rather like any other. Normal watching of television. In fact, it was 10 p.m. that Mrs. Graves took her iPad and a book to bed. She was the first to go to bed. She was staying on the ground floor at the back of the house.
We understand in the morning her sister woke up with her partner. Her partner decided to go down to the farm shop to get some breakfast goods. Noticed that the bedroom door was slightly ajar, didn't think anything of it. He went out to the shops. Her sister then went in to check on Valerie and sadly found her clearly deceased in bed.
There were many rumours circulating about why did nobody hear her scream? Was this an inside job? Was there somebody in the house perhaps that knew what had happened? It was a really strange time because a lot of fingers were being pointed in a lot of directions.
Certainly at the beginning, you have to keep a very open mind in relation to what may have happened. And unfortunately, that involves including, were family members involved in this? And so you have to sort of hold them at arm's length to a certain extent, ask them a number of questions in relation to their movements.
Intense questioning of Valerie's family begins.
I do remember conversations about the fact that the family hadn't heard anything upstairs and she was downstairs, and a lot of people were like, well, how did they not hear anything? Was it something to do with the family? Was there more to it than that? It was, obviously people were speculating.
Initial reports into her death reveal a brutal attack.
The injuries to Mrs. Graves were akin to a high-speed, head-on collision.
So how could no one in the house have heard anything?
You have that gut feeling. You sense when you're speaking to people, looking at them in the eye, as to whether or not you think they are involved. And obviously, it'll be a very traumatic scene for the family there, and very unlikely that you're going to get crocodile tears under those circumstances. And again, you want to know what sort of relationship the family have with Valerie and why would they want to do that. So I think, whilst you can't rule them out straight away, you get a quick sense of whether or not they're involved.
Speculation and theories about the motive escalate. But as the family is ruled out, suspicion falls on the local villagers.
There was always a slight fear in the back of your mind that it could be someone that you knew in the village and that they might still be on the loose.
The feeling everywhere seemed to be that of panic, worry, apprehension. Nobody could quite believe that somebody could be murdered, especially while sleeping in their own bed over the Christmas period. People just felt unsafe, really. Would this person attack again? Who was next?
In the pretty coastal village of Bosham, news is spreading that artist Valerie Graves has been brutally murdered while house-sitting over Christmas.
I work for some elderly clients that live in Bosham Home, and they were absolutely petrified because they're both in their 80s. The realisation that there's obviously a murderer out there, that the lady had been murdered in her sleep and they didn't know why.
When the details did come out, and you realise the gravity and the viciousness of the attack. It was quite worrying at the time. For a few months, everyone was sort of watching themselves or looking over their shoulders a little bit, thinking, could it be him? Could it be her?
With a murder investigation underway, police need to consider who would want to harm Valerie. Due to tides and flooding in the village at that time of year, police believe it's unlikely to have been an opportunist burglar. Meaning one thing, the killer has to be local.
The weather was particularly miserable, lots of local floods going on, and it's not the sort of area that passing traffic would go through. You have to sort of go out of your way to get into Bosham. And so I would imagine over that period it was almost a kind of a lockdown in that area where the locals would just stay there and no one would come to visit unless it was to visit family and friends.
The area was pretty flooded. Not many visitors would have come to the area at this time of the year. It's Christmas. People would be spending time with their families together. And there was no real need for visitors, so the speculation was it must have been somebody local.
With the community the centre of a major investigation, everyone is a suspect.
The police came knocking on everybody's doors, and literally everybody. I mean, they came with a tool, and they would interview each member of the family separately.
Police have several avenues in which to explore.
You'd also want to know who else has access to that address. So we know that the occupiers are away on holiday. A few phone calls could easily establish where they are and whether they had opportunity to get back to the address. But you're also thinking, well, who would do this and why would they do this? You know, Valerie was 55 years of age, she was in bed, she posed no threat to anyone, and so why would somebody do this? And you then start thinking about who lives in the area that could possibly have the motive to do this.
Having ruled out Valerie's family and the owners of the house, who were abroad, Valerie's body is taken for a post-mortem examination. Could this lead provide clues as to the cause of death and the sort of person who would commit such an atrocious crime?
The thing that all post-mortems are looking for is a medical cause of death. Physically, why is this person dead? But the forensic post-mortem also looks at, in more detail, the injuries present, patterns of injury, what the likely implement that may have caused them was, when they may have occurred, and really trying to get a much more clear narrative of the events surrounding this person's death. The expertise is in what sort of weapon was it, how much force was used, have they defended themselves.
The principal injuries were to her head. I'm looking at the pathology report now. There was extreme complexity to the wounds, signs of multiple blows from a heavy object, impossible for the pathologist to determine just how many blows.
It's a physical effort to strike someone multiple times with sufficient force to damage them. It is not an easy task, and it is not something that can be achieved in a second or two. This is a sustained, violent assault.
The injuries that not only cause laceration of the skin, but also complete disruption of the central facial skeleton of the jaw, together with depressed fractures of the skull, with extending fractures to the base of the skull. And there was a patterned injury to the left side of the forehead, showing a semicircle, which, in the pathologist's opinion, would be consistent with the application of force from the round end of a hammer.
If somebody has died as a result of multiple blows with a hammer to the head, it will be clear from the size and shape of the injuries that that is what occurred. The normal head of the hammer is going to leave round to oval lacerations and abrasions when it strikes the body.
Having discovered Valerie was battered to death with a hammer, tragically, the post-mortem reveals how she tried to fight off her attacker.
There's a level of defensive injury sustained to Mrs. Graves. Her left hand she must have raised above her head to shield her head from the blows, revealed extensive bruising to the back of her hand, together with fractures of 2 of the bones of that hand.
Police still cannot believe no one in the house heard the attack. But now they have a new focus. Could the hammer reveal clues as to the perpetrator? And does the killer still have it?
You then have a cursory search around the premises to make sure that the weapon hasn't been left by the offender, because that could yield some forensic opportunities. And then you work your way into the grounds of the premises and bring in sufficient officers to conduct that search, which will include lifting up drains, looking at people's bins, going through people's gardens, and then just increasing out from the crime scene itself in case the offender has taken the weapon with them and then discarded it en route back to wherever they come from.
With the pressure on to find a hammer-wielding killer, local tradespeople are under the spotlight.
When I got interviewed by the police, it's because I was working for my elderly clients, so they'd obviously lived in the area, and I worked for them, so they were interviewing everybody that was in the local vicinity. So, you know, they wanted to know exactly what make of hammer that I had in the van, and yeah, it was quite worrying.
And it isn't long before their hunch pays off and police make an announcement.
A man has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of an artist who was found dead at a property she was house-sitting over the Christmas period.
He lived very close to the scene of the crime, together with the fact that his occupation was manual, he was a labourer, may well have led the police to arrest him.
With a man being questioned, police continue to build their case and look for evidence.
They'll also be doing other forensic examinations within the crime scene, so there will be a number of fingerprints, for example, that may turn up within the house that are alien to that address. But it could be a window cleaner, it could be somebody who's done work in that address previously. And so these inquiries need to be bottomed out. And sometimes if you get a fingerprint of an individual together with an account that cannot be corroborated and they're not alibied, then that will give sufficient grounds for the police to arrest the individual and put further questions to them under caution.
The arrested man is interviewed extensively by police.
Despite the fact he spent some time in police custody, he was fully exonerated.
Police are back to square one. But then a discovery is made.
A weapon was found about 600 metres away from the home. It was that of a red claw hammer.
The finding of the hammer was absolutely crucial. It had the blood of Mrs. Graves on it, and therefore was the murder weapon.
And the hammer itself had been exposed to the elements for a couple of days, which means the opportunity to yield forensic evidence is reducing daily. But that said, the scientists were able to yield a DNA profile confirming Valerie's DNA. And then what the scientists also found was a very small partial DNA, and all they could say was that it related to a male individual.
Police now believe for certain Valerie's killer was male. Who is he? And why would he want Valerie dead? Investigations ramp up a notch and the search for the owner of the hammer begins.
The hammer was a 16-ounce forged steel claw hammer, the sort of hammer you'd find from any DIY store. But to show the depth of the police investigation, they contacted Screwfix, who are the company who manufactured this hammer, and then trawled through the records of those suppliers who had sold this type of hammer and then tried to eliminate purchasers from their inquiries.
The risks around having a partial profile is obviously you don't know who it belongs to, and actually it could be an innocent profile. So it could have been, you know, the shopkeeper that sold that hammer. It could be their profile. It could be somebody who's borrowed that hammer. So it may not necessarily link to the murderer, but at least it gives you an idea as to who you want to speak to that may have had contact with that hammer. and then that can then lead on to further inquiries.
With a partial DNA profile on the hammer, every male in the surrounding area is suddenly the focus of police attention.
The next step then is to start looking at males within the area, matching a certain criteria, who they're then going to ask to come forward and voluntarily give their DNA. It's a very expensive and time-consuming process.
Everybody was asked to come and volunteer, including people such as the postman, people that live nearby, anybody in the area.
They set up a mass DNA screening process where they asked local men from the age of 17 and upwards to come to a location, bring their ID with them, give them a thumbprint, and then offer a DNA sample that can then be checked against the partial male DNA profile that the police already had, so that they could either be ruled in or ruled out of that investigation.
So the response locally was outstanding because there was a joint desire in this small village town of Bosham that they wanted the culprit caught. Not just, of course, for Mrs. Graves and her friends and family, but because they had, on the face of it, a very dangerous man out loose.
There was DNA testing stations set up around the village. Myself and a few friends, and there's loads of us, all went to, everyone that I know of went and got tested. I don't think anyone refused or didn't go. I think it was the sort of thing that actually, do you know what? If you haven't got anything to hide, then you've got no problem going and doing a DNA test.
Months of DNA screening takes place in Bosham and the surrounding villages.
So the police will do all they can to try and detect this crime. They need to do this for the family, but also to reassure the community that there isn't somebody dangerous still out and about. So they'll be undertaking all sorts of inquiries. The forensic searches alone will take, many weeks, if not months. And then with those samples will take many more months to then try and establish whether any DNA can be taken from those samples.
But as time ticks away, the hunt for Valerie's killer goes cold.
The police were at a loss. There were no new leads, nobody had come forward with any more information.
5 years after her murder, Valerie's family, the police, and the villagers of Bosham are left fearing her killer will never be found.
So they were mystified, absolutely mystified. Who could have wanted this lady harm?
It's 5 years since the murder of Valerie Graves in the quaint coastal resort of Bosham in West Sussex, and police are no nearer to a suspect or a motive.
At first, we thought there might be a quick outcome to solving the crime, because it's quite a heinous crime, but there was nothing at all for weeks, and then months, and then ultimately years.
Having found a partial DNA profile of a male on a hammer believed to be the murder weapon, police have spread their net around the surrounding villages in the hunt for a suspect.
It led to thousands of hours of police work. 4,500 occupants of local homes in the area were questioned. 600 statements taken. 3,059 males were eliminated by large-scale DNA screening.
In December 2018, I had a statement from the police renewing their appeal to find Valerie's murderer 5 years on. It was a really good statement. They were offering a substantial reward for any information at all. So for me, this was my front page story for that week. It was Christmas, it was a quiet news week anyway, and this was a real heartfelt story that I felt people needed to read about, even at this time. It might just jog someone's memory, it might just nudge them to remembering something that perhaps they felt was insignificant, but that would help police lead to an arrest at last and help the family put this to bed at last.
The police can't solve this on their own. They do need the assistance of the community, and quite often they will use the media to support them with that. Sadly, at times we have to offer a financial incentive for people to come forward, so it's not unusual for a reward to be put up for information that would lead to the arrest and prosecution of the offender. But you hope in cases like this that really do trouble the community, that, you know, somebody, if they had information, they would come forward and they wouldn't be motivated by money.
With no clues as to who killed Valerie, police take a step back and re-examine the moments leading to her death. The attack had been so ferocious, so how had no one in the house heard a thing?
So this was a large house. Her sister and her mother and her sister's partner were sleeping in bedrooms upstairs. Valerie was sleeping downstairs in a ground floor bedroom where there were patio doors that then led on to the back garden. At that point, we know that somebody then entered those patio doors and then, sadly, brutally murdered her with a blunt instrument.
Police dig a little deeper into their victim.
The profile of Valerie Graves did surprise us all as a victim. She was just an ordinary person, for as far as we know, had no reason to be murdered in such a way or at all.
Valerie had spent a few days looking after the sumptuous property off Smugglers Lane with her sister, sister's partner, and her mum. And December 29th, 2013 was a quiet night in.
We know that Valerie and her family were in the house. They pretty much stayed in that evening to watch TV, as most families do. I think they were probably getting tired of the Christmas period. You know, Christmas had followed, birthday celebration had taken place, and it was a normal evening. So they'd all watched TV, and then by about 10 o'clock that evening, they all put themselves to bed.
Mrs. Graves was found by her sister the following morning. Initially, she thought that her sister was sleeping in. She shouted out, her door was slightly ajar, the door to her bedroom, and there was no response. She thought perhaps she was lying in. And it was only later, when she went in through that door, she saw Mrs. Graves' legs sticking out under the duvet and realised that she was cold. And in panic, of course, naturally, she then rang the police.
Was this a planned murder? Had Valerie been targeted?
For me, there would be a number of hypotheses. The first one is that this is possibly a family member. You know, there'd been a dispute that evening and things have got out of hand, and, you know, and unfortunately, Valerie's been assaulted. Another hypothesis is that she was targeted, but you then think, well, who would know she was there? This isn't her home address, so is she under surveillance by somebody? Is there a relationship that's gone wrong in the past that somebody is looking to assault and injure Valerie?
Well, the police found it extremely difficult to ascertain why someone would attack Mrs. Graves. She was well-known, well-liked, well-loved, and they found it very difficult to imagine anyone would target her.
Police had already ruled out Valerie's distraught family and find nothing in her background which could suggest someone holds a grudge against her.
They thought, perhaps naturally, that it was a case of mistaken identity, an attacker wanting to seek vengeance on someone for some reason.
The people that owned the house, there were all sorts of rumours that went round about them, and hitmen and all sorts of silly rumours.
Rumours even spread that the house had been advertised on a site for swingers wanting sex parties, and that the family had been there at the wrong time.
There was a lot of wild rumour and speculation at the time. Some of it completely untrue, some of it perhaps a little bit more close to the truth.
But with no real clues coming forward, police home in on one explanation.
Some of these villages, people are of the mindset they don't have to lock their doors, whereas if you live in a city centre, you're probably more likely to do that. Was this an opportunist burglar who just happened to be in the area? Again, unlikely, I would have thought, because it's such a remote location, and therefore, was it a burglar who knew exactly what they were going for? Because they knew that the occupants were away.
Police now believe Valerie's murder was the result of a burglary gone wrong. and that the burglar knew the owners were due to be away. But even that theory throws up questions.
What seemed rather peculiar was that if it was a burglary, why was nothing taken? Seems rather a lot of effort and savagery, for want of a better word, to then leave empty-handed. So they were mystified, absolutely mystified.
Having already tested thousands of locals for their DNA and come up blank, and despite offering a reward for information leading to an arrest, police are still no closer to a suspect. And then, everything changes.
On the 10th of July 2019, Cristian Sabu was arrested at his home address in Romania. He was asked whether he'd killed Valerie Graves.
But who is Cristian Sabu? And what would he know about such a brutal and bloody murder all those years ago? Five and a half years after the brutal murder of grandmother Valerie Graves in the village of Bosham, West Sussex, there's been a development.
The police got in touch with us in July 2019 to let us know that an arrest had been made for Valerie's murder. This came as a huge shock to everybody. It seemed to come out of nowhere at all.
Hearing the name Valerie Graves come up again in the news was quite a shock, and yeah, hearing that they'd made an arrest.
The man is 28-year-old Cristian Sabu. But what had led to an arrest of a man in Romania so long after the murder?
Years had passed since the brutal murder of Valerie, and the police finally had a breakthrough in that they had been contacted by email by a lady in Transylvania, in Romania, indicating that her husband was responsible for the murder.
But who is he? Did he kill Valerie, and why?
What the police have managed to establish is back in 2013, Cristian Sabu had moved from Romania over to England and was living in a caravan on the A27 in West Sussex, very close to Bosham. Some suggestion he was looking for work, may have done a bit of scrap metal dealing, but also some local odd jobs as well in the area.
Cristian Sabu left the UK and went back to Romania. That is where he lived with his partner, had a child, lived a normal, as it turns out, law-abiding life.
But 5 years later, Cristian Sabu's partner and mother of his 2 children tips off police that her husband is the killer.
When the police receive information like this, you have to be very cautious in the first instance. You have to question what the motive is for this female to come forward and say that Cristian Sabu was responsible for the murder. I understand they were going through some matrimonial difficulties at that time. So, you know, was her motive to try and, get him into trouble when perhaps he may have been an innocent person?
His wife had seen on Google that he'd been searching about the murder.
He'd been checking out the reporting of the Valerie Graves murder in Bosham back in 2013. And at that time, her and her husband were living just down the road on the A27 in West Sussex.
And she recognised the hammer that he'd been looking at. And she confronted him and asked him, isn't this the hammer that you had in England?
But reporting her suspicions to police is not enough to arrest Cristian Sabu for murder. They need irrefutable proof to secure a European arrest warrant to bring him back to the UK. Focus turns back to the hammer found discarded near the crime scene. Could this now hold the key to solving the case?
What the police did have was this partial male DNA profile, which could either implicate or eliminate Cristian Sabu very, very easily if we had his DNA.
But Cristian Sabu appears to have lived a crime-free life. His DNA is not on the UK or European police database, so they turned to his partner for help.
The police had to think long and hard as to how were they going to get a DNA sample from Christian Sabu without alerting him, because if we do alert him, then, without arresting him, he could disappear and then we may never catch him. And so what they asked for through the Romanian police and Christian Sabu's wife was to get DNA samples from his 2 children, which could then show a familial link to the partial DNA profile. And that's what they did.
And the results changed the course of the now cold murder investigation.
It came back as a likeliness that the partial DNA profile that they had found on the hammer was linked to Christian Sabu.
And then, of course, under a European arrest warrant, to bring Mr. Sabu, to his credit, without any fuss, he didn't object, he cooperated fully, and he was then brought to England.
I felt really sorry for his wife. Finding out this news must have been really horrific. This is someone that she's been married to for some time, she has children with. It must have been a real devastating blow to her. She must have feared for her own safety and for her children. I can't imagine what was going through her mind at the time. It must have been really horrible. And I imagine she was probably torn as well. This is the man that she's married to, that she no doubt loves. And she's probably in a really difficult situation.
On 19th July 2019, Christian Sabu is extradited to the UK.
The feeling in the village and the surrounding areas was just pure relief. People felt like, at last, this had been solved.
Sabu appears at Brighton Magistrates Court, charged with the murder of Valerie Graves.
Mr. Sabu presented as a thoroughly normal man. Uncomplicated. He was uncomplicated from the moment I met him. He was quiet. He wasn't a man of many words, though of course we had an interpreter. He still was not a man who spoke much. He was still, I thought, even with all the years, he was 22 at the time of the incident, 28 when I met him. He was still in shock. That was my belief about what had happened. He couldn't explain it to himself. And he was remorseful.
The man standing before court is at odds with the description of such a brutal killing.
He basically admitted the crime. He said that, he had little money, he was aware of the house, he knew that there were valuables inside that house, and more importantly, he knew that the owners were away over the Christmas period. So when he broke in, he was surprised to see Valerie, who confronted him. He had the hammer in his possession, and sadly, he then beat her with that hammer.
In November 2019, Christian Sabu takes the stand at Lewes Crown Court.
It was always the intention that he would be pleading guilty to the murder of Mrs. Graves.
He did say that he felt bad about it. He didn't mean to hurt her. He told the court how he had something to drink, cycled to the property in the belief that the property was empty. He'd gone there to burgle the place, effectively, and he was shocked to find Valerie there. He said that he panicked, and that's when the attack took place. He said that he'd never meant to hurt her.
What remains perhaps a mystery to this day is why Mr. Sabu, on realising that there was someone in that room and in the house, simply didn't turn and leave. But he did strike her several times with extreme force. And I think only he will know what was going through his mind, but clearly full of panic. Alcohol, panic, stupidity.
Summing up the case, the judge accepted that Sabu had not intended to kill, and sentenced him to 24 years in prison.
The judge on sentencing, Christian Sabu, said this: Mrs. Graves' head injuries were so severe that her maximum survival time would have been less than an hour. This was a sustained attack, and the terror and trauma for her in the final few minutes of her life is unimaginable. You had gone to those premises intending to burgle them, to steal from a safe you believed contained a lot of money. You took with you the hammer. You say you had been told the owners were away and therefore were unaware that Valerie, her mum, her sister and her sister's partner would all be in the house. It appears you entered the house via the patio doors in the room in which Mrs. Graves was sleeping. When you realised your mistake, namely that the room was occupied, rather than simply running away in the hope you couldn't be identified by a woman waking from sleep, you launched this horrific attack on Mrs. Graves, who had been asleep in that room. It was your dishonesty and greed that took you to the house. It was your cowardice and lack of morality that caused you to kill Valerie Graves.
7 years since the murder of Valerie Graves, the village of Bosham is slowly returning to normal. But the crime still lingers over them.
Although this had gone on for such a long time, it was in the forefront of a lot of people's minds. There was always that feeling of who did it. And I'm sure many of the men in the area perhaps felt they might have been looked at.
I mean, I was very glad that he got caught because it meant you can just go back to normal life. Whereas before, you do have this nickel in the background that somebody's murdered somebody from locally, because who else would go there? For a long time, we did think it must be somebody around here. I mean, who else could have done it?
I think the general feeling was one of relief that actually, you know, the chap had been found and the family could get some peace. Also that it wasn't someone in the village. I think that was, you know, even after all that time, I think that was still a bit of a relief that it wasn't a chap living up the road or, you know, someone you may know.
And the family of Valerie Graves can finally try to rebuild their lives.
We have had to endure 6 years of waiting, not knowing if anyone would ever be brought to justice for this cowardly act. Mum was very much loved by our family, but sorely missed by us all.
With as much drama in their personal lives as in their jobs, the FBI team have their work cut out. Join them Tuesday at 9, new to Sky Mix.
Please, how can I help? There was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
People came across the suitcase and opened it, and inside was the remains of a person.
Local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here.
For a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was absolutely shocking for the community.
We had knowledge that he had over £270,000 worth of debt, and he was struggling to pay off those debts.
There was blood absolutely everywhere in that room, on the sofa, on the walls and on the ceiling.
Through extreme measures, he used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
Tint
Tintwistle is an idyllic village nestled on the edge of the Peak District.
Tintwistle is a typical Peak District village. It's got a mixture of beautiful stone cottages. It's on the banks of the Longdendale Valley, and behind it are the Tintwistle Moors, known as the Nar and the Lower Moor. And it has stunning views over the Longdendale Valley and the 5 reservoirs.
A very parochial village where people can leave your back door open, no problems.
In Tintwistle, everyone knows each other. It's a very, neighbourly feel. It's a very close-knit community.
We've got a lot of people who have a lot of very good neighbours, and I think everybody supports each other.
In terms of crime rates in Tintwistle, it's fairly, non-existent.
But all this is about to change when the peace is shattered early one morning.
On the 10th of October, there was a 999 call received from dog walkers that had found a suitcase on a lay-by just near the road.
The location was on a main road that went between Manchester and Sheffield, and it dipped down a little bit into Derbyshire. It was a car park off the main road, but it was an area that was quite popular for walkers.
As you come into Tintwistle from the east, you go along what's called the Woodhead Pass, and this particular suitcase was dumped just over the wall as you go into the village beside the first reservoir.
As I remember, it's like this people passing by this lay-by and came across a suitcase and opened it, and inside the suitcase was the remains of a person.
Police are immediately dispatched to the area.
There's quite a long drive, really, from the point where I got the call to the point where I arrived at the scene. Just to give you some idea around the geography, when I first got the call, I was in Derby, which is here. The deposition site was all the way to the north of the county, to the north of Derbyshire, and as you can see, it's right at the very tip of the county.
Upon arrival, they are met with a gruesome sight.
It looks like the suitcase has been set on fire, and inside that suitcase we have a body of a man whose head has been removed, whose arms have been removed, and whose feet have been removed.
It was a Samsonite suitcase that was in an extremely charred state. But then it became apparent, and we had a human torso that had been extremely cruelly dismembered and burnt.
As a crime, this is really, really vicious. For somebody to remove all the limbs of a body, never mind commit the murder itself.
Derbyshire Constabulary launch a murder investigation, and news of the horrific find soon spreads around the village.
Oh, like chicken pox. Everybody talks about it, we all know about it. You go in the local shops. Have you heard?
In Tintwistle, it's a really neighbourly community. Everyone knows each other. If there's gossip, someone down the road will know about it in 10 minutes or so. Considering the crime rate was fairly non-existent, for a murder to happen, not only a murder, but a murder on this scale, it was completely shocking for the community.
I think local people found it extraordinary that such an incident could happen here. I think, like all major crimes that happen in what everybody would regard as somewhere quiet and peace-loving, it adds to people's fear that something else could happen, or something else could happen as a result of it.
Police immediately cordon off the crime scene.
The big issue you've got here is you're out in the open. So there's two things. There's the weather, so rain can come and wash away your evidence. But secondly, you've got the issue of privacy. This is a really busy road, there's lots of traffic coming through, and you need to protect the privacy of that individual. That's really important.
Really what you want to do is secure and preserve as much evidence as you can. So there would have been things like identifying where the scene is, making sure that it was cordoned off, that there was enough police officers to ensure that nobody stumbled across the scene.
Beyond the scene, you might be looking at further searches. Has anything discarded, any clothing, any weapons, etc. So this particular point is very important from a forensic point of view. So you would want to be able to get some of your experts down, you want your crime scene manager, you'd really want your pathologist to be coming down to having a look at the scene, just so they have a full understanding of what's here, so that they can do a better job down the line.
And what I would do there is I'd have a discussion with the crime scene manager about the best way of removing the body to a hospital, but also making sure that we didn't lose any evidence while we were in that process, because the evidence that you might lose might be the only evidence that you get that helps you with the case.
Once you start moving a body, then the issue there is a potential loss of evidence, so there'll be some sampling requirements there and then, even in the circumstances where a body's been burnt. For example, there may well be fibres that have been transferred from the offender to the body, or alternatively to the suitcase, that haven't been damaged. It's really important to pick those up at that point.
The body is removed, and police focus on one thing.
But I think when you look at the wider picture around this is somebody's life. This is that they've lost, and you know what I really want to do is find out who the family is, who are the relatives and the friends of this individual, and they need informing at the earliest opportunity.
This was going to be a huge challenge for the police now, because there's absolutely nothing to go by. They've just found a torso. There's nothing to identify the person, no fingerprints.
When you're looking at the difficulty presented by not being able to make an identification, the first things that we considered were things like the police database, and then we started looking at people who were missing, but because we had quite a wide geographical area, it was looking at people who were perhaps missing from West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, as well as Derbyshire. But it's an arterial route, could have been from anywhere.
With very little to go on, the pressure is on for the police to try to identify the body.
You head towards the things that you are quite confident that will bring about an identification. But then when the obvious start to go, then it progressively becomes more and more difficult. And you start considering any other locations or any other information that you may get that you think will help you identify who this person was. So it made it a really difficult inquiry where we were having to be very, very precise around the investigative tactics that we used to try and find out who were the people who were involved.
Whilst the police await lab results from the pathologist's examination of the body, their attention turns to other lines of inquiry.
So the first point of call for the police now would have been to conduct local inquiries, asking people if they'd seen anything, if they'd heard anything.
When these things initially happen, all sorts of stories start to abound.
But the question on everybody's lips is, who is the victim?
Foremost in my mind was, there is a family somewhere whose loved one has been murdered, and they don't know about it.
In the picturesque Peak District, police have launched a murder investigation after an unidentified body was discovered in a suitcase which had been set alight.
So the condition of the body when we found it, the head had been removed, both hands had been removed, and the feet had been removed. There were two things that I sort of realised quite quickly. One, that was a deposition site. That wasn't where the murder had taken place. That was where the body had been placed afterwards. And the second thing was, and it was around whether the victim and the offender knew each other. And I took the view that why would one take the steps to hide somebody's identity if they didn't know each other? So I sort of realised in my own mind that if I worked out who the victim was, I would be able to work out who the offender was. And if I worked out who the offender was, I'd be able to work out who the victim was.
Unable to identify their victim, police await the results of the post-mortem.
Slightly unusually, there was no cause of death. So this tells us that there was no marks or scars or any wounds on the body parts that we had recovered, and clearly the victim's head had been removed. When we looked at the information that we did have from the post-mortem, this was a light-skinned male, and that's all that we were able really to glean from that. From the post-mortem, there were no marks, scars, tattoos or anything that would have assisted us making an identification.
Police trawl the missing persons database for any clues as to who their victim could be.
At the time, there was a lot of missing persons cases, so this could have been absolutely anybody.
There's quite a lot of missing people reported every single day in Derbyshire. And it was a case of refreshing those every single day, because the person may not be reported on day 1 or day 2 or day 3, but every single day going through the detail of who those individuals were and seeing if we could make a connection between the body that we got and that person who was missing.
With little to go on, Derbyshire Constabulary hold a press conference.
The purpose of today's press conference is to ask for the public's help to identify the victim. We are working with other forces to ascertain whether our victim may have been reported missing in a neighbouring county, but we recognise that he might not have been reported missing at all. We are therefore asking members of the public to come forward if they have not seen a neighbour or a friend or a colleague, or indeed any members of their family recently. A special call centre has been set up to take calls from across the UK, and we are urging people to provide information in relation to this murder investigation.
Information soon starts to filter into the police.
It became apparent that a number of dog walkers had seen the suitcase but hadn't realised exactly what was inside.
So in order to better understand the time frame that we're looking at and understand when the body may have been put in the car park, we did substantial inquiries with people who'd been on the road. We were asking for people who'd got dash cam footage or people that had driven past, and there were a few positive responses out of that, which were able to tell us that the fire had been set late the night before.
With 3 different drivers claiming to have seen a fire around 11:30 p.m. on the 9th of October, officers on the ground can now focus on who was in the area around that time in a bid to identify the potential killer.
So that was really useful from the initial investigation point of view to be able to really narrow those timelines so you could concentrate on that time period and work out from there what the offender had done, where he'd been, where he'd likely to travel to and from.
Police now ramp up their inquiries.
There was a bolt out of the blue, and we got we got a phone call in from South Yorkshire to inform us that there was actually an ANPR camera on the A628. So the phone call that we got on that day was, do you know you've got an ANPR camera on the 628? And no, we didn't, but thanks very much for telling us, that's really great.
Police immediately trawl through the automatic number plate recognition cameras to establish which vehicles had passed through the area on the night in question.
The police followed ANPR camera footage and located a Mercedes vehicle that triggered the camera just after 11 o'clock on Sunday the 9th, the evening before, and then didn't actually make it all the way across Woodhead Pass Road and to trigger the other ANPR camera at the other end.
It was the only vehicle that passed in the window of opportunity. So every other vehicle only went in one direction, either towards Manchester or towards Yorkshire.
All the vehicles, over 200 that had travelled along that road within the time period, down to one that had turned around and returned back to the Manchester area.
That was a strong indication that that vehicle was the one that deposited the body here on the night of the 9th.
After 10 days of round-the-clock investigations, and still having no clue as to the identity of their victim or suspect, this discovery is key.
The Mercedes triggered the camera on the evening before between 23:09 and 23:26. So straight away that was something I was very interested in, and we started to make some inquiries as to who might be the owner and what might be the significance of that vehicle.
This was absolutely key in the investigation. After 10 days of not finding anything, they needed to find out who this silver Mercedes belonged to.
As it happened, the vehicle didn't have any insurance, and so there was a reason to go and stop it and speak to the driver and have a look at the vehicle.
After further investigation, police discover that the vehicle is registered to someone living in Manchester.
So the owner of the vehicle was somebody called Ming Jiang.
Once the vehicle had been identified, it was registered to Ming Jiang, and therefore this triggered for the police to monitor him, make inquiries as to where he lived, inquiries of where he went.
There was so much pressure on the police. At this point in the investigation, it was very time sensitive. After 10 days, they really needed to find this person. At this point, the person who committed the crime could have run away, they could have covered up, or they could have very much so committed again.
Initial inquiries reveal Ming Jiang lives in Manchester, so Derbyshire Constabulary enlist the help of their colleagues over there.
When Greater Manchester Police assisted us, they were able to locate the vehicle, and because it was driven without any insurance, we were able to seize it. And when we seized the vehicle, we were then able to forensically examine it. And what I was looking for in that forensic examination was to find any evidence that might link to the body that we've got and the scene that we'd preserved some days before.
The police found a speck of blood in the rear that was the size of a 10p coin.
This was a really, really big moment in the investigation. What I would be looking to find out there is a blood spot in the boot of the vehicle the same as the blood that we found at the scene. So the DNA was sent away for comparison. It was the longest 24 hours I can imagine. Eventually it came back, and it came back with the news that we were really hoping for, and that was that the blood in the boot matched the DNA of the blood at the scene.
The blood match in the boot of the car puts Ming Jiang at the forefront of the investigation.
I felt this was the first time we were getting a breakthrough and first time we were getting an indication as to what may have taken place here. So as soon as we got the positive information about the DNA hit, it was a case of let's get this person arrested at the earliest opportunity.
So Ming Jiang was arrested on the 20th of October. They'd attended a casino in Manchester where they believed he was, and he was arrested at that location.
Now that the police have Ming Jiang in custody for questioning, time is of the essence to find evidence linking him to the murder.
What is also part of the inquiry is to start doing an evidential search around him to understand where he lived, what his movements were, and whether there was any other evidence that we'd be able to glean from his home address.
The police searched the home address, and they found bloodstains all over the carpet. There was blood dispersion across all of the walls. They had been painted over, and quite a shoddy clean-up had taken place. It was an extensive clean-up, but there was still blood throughout the flat and in the bathroom.
There was traces of blood absolutely everywhere that weren't immediately apparent to the eye. But there were things like the blood had seeped through the laminate flooring. There was blood that was soaked into the cushions on the sofa. There was blood on the walls and on the ceiling.
So the scene was a really rich source of evidence for us. The main evidence we got were 2 finger marks in blood. So we got one under a table, and the evidence you're really looking for there is the offender's fingerprint in the victim's blood. And getting that in 2 places was very, very critical evidence.
At this point, it's absolutely safe for the police to say that the murder took place in this apartment.
10 days into the investigation of the body in the suitcase found in a Derbyshire village, police have discovered a car linked to the murder and have made an arrest.
A forensics team investigated the car. They swabbed the blood. This matched the torso that was found in the suitcase. So at this point, the police were then able to arrest Mr. Ming Jiang.
Forensic tests reveal the blood on the torso in the suitcase is a match for the blood in Jiang's flat in Manchester, making Ming Jiang their #1 suspect.
So the investigation moved over to Manchester because it became clear from the Derbyshire point of view that the offence had actually taken place in Manchester. As a result of their inquiries, that took them to the flat at Falconwood Way in Beswick. And as a result of what they found there, they felt very strongly that that was actually the place of the murder. And so as a result of that, that would then become a Manchester investigation.
But police are no closer to identifying their victim.
So as the inquiry goes on, the stress and the pressure builds. As a senior investigating officer, it's a privilege to do that role. But you do take the responsibility of having to investigate the death of somebody, and you owe that responsibility to the family of the victim. So I was really concerned about finding out who that was and getting that information to them at the earliest opportunity.
However, searches of their suspect and his car have led to a discovery.
When we did the evidential search of the Mercedes vehicle, we found some banking documents of another person called Yang Lu.
He had certain possessions on his person. At the time, he had his passport, he had his bank cards.
And that led us to an address in Salford at Media City. And there were some lines of inquiry that we needed to conduct at that address and find out what the relationship was with this person and how they fitted into the inquiry.
Police immediately sent officers to Yang Lu's address.
There was no answer, it was nowhere to be seen by anybody. So I made the decision that we were going to force entry into that apartment and find out really who this person was. So we forced entry into the address at Media City. Nothing particularly remarkable about the address, but what it did allow us to do was take some items from there which we knew the owner of that apartment would have left their DNA on. So very quickly we were able to send that away for analysis.
Finally, there is a breakthrough. Results come back matching Yang Lu's DNA to the torso, as well as the blood found in Ming Jiang's flat and car. Almost 2 weeks after the discovery, police have the name of their victim.
So what we did find out was that Yang Lu was a 27-year-old male, originally from China.
Yang Lu came to the UK in 2000 to study, where he went to the University of Leeds. His family actually worked really, really hard to save money so that he could study in the UK and achieve his goals and his dreams.
He finished his master's degree, and after that he stayed here and become a shares and stock trader.
He'd not brought any of his family with him over here, so if you look at the reasons why he may not have been reported missing, his family simply didn't know that he wasn't where he should have been.
Police now have the harrowing task of informing their victim's family.
This was a really difficult case from a family point of view. Under normal circumstances, we'd want to inform the family in person. And in the end, we actually had to make the call to the family in order to inform them. That's something that we wouldn't normally do under any circumstances, but unfortunately with the distance involved, we had no other option. I arranged for contact through Interpol with the Chinese authorities in order to let the family know. In the meantime, we allocated family liaison officers in order that we could make the process as smooth as possible.
Yang's family were absolutely devastated when they found out, their only son had been murdered. Not only murdered, but in such a vicious way.
And then they arrived in the UK in the second week of November.
Yang was very close to his family. They spoke on the phone near enough every single day. He actually vowed to go back to China and look after his family if one of them was to fall ill. And I think that just shows the tight-knit relationship they have, because he'd built himself this fantastic life in the UK and he was really willing to give that up to go back and look after his family.
When the family was here, then I helped them in different ways because they can't speak English. So most of the time that if they have something do not understand about the police procedure, and I help to explain them.
They were completely grief-stricken. They had lost their only son, who had come to the United Kingdom to study at university. He was a very clever young academic man and a very bright young man, and they were deprived of their son.
With time running out to hold their suspect in custody, police need to work fast to build enough evidence to charge him.
Ming Jiang is a danger to the public, and we would really want to be in a position where he'd be charged at that point. The secondary issue is he's a big flight risk. We'd be worried about him kind of moving back to China or elsewhere.
We had to prove that he was the person that had committed that murder. We knew he was involved and could prove that to the extent, and we then had to build a case.
There's no doubt that Ming Jiang tried to cover his tracks quite extensively, but the problem is there was just too much evidence. The evidence there in particular was extremely strong. It's almost the best evidence you can find at a scene, which was Yang Lu's blood and Ming Jiang's fingerprint.
Police now believe Ming Jiang murdered Yang Lu in his flat, dismembered his body, and dumped his torso in a suitcase before setting light to it. But they need to work out the link between the pair and establish when the murder happened, so trawl CCTV footage in the days leading up to the discovery of the suitcase.
CCTV footage revealed a man getting off the tram in Manchester. He crossed the road to meet another man and they went in the direction of a flat in Beswick.
That tram stop was the closest one to where Ming Jiang's home address was.
The male he met up with perfectly fit the description of Ming Jiang. And in addition to that, we had telephone evidence that showed the two phones of Ming Jiang and Yang Lu came together. And interestingly, from that point onwards, the phones always remained together. And that was the very last time that Yang Lu was seen.
With the evidence building, police make a decision.
So I authorised one charge of murder.
Ming Jiang denies any involvement in the murder, so the police and prosecution need to build a case for trial and establish a motive, meaning they have to delve deeper into the lives of the two men.
Yang Lu was definitely a responsible young man. He invested in stocks and shares, and he knew how to make money. He was very clever in that sense. He'd built himself this brand new life in the UK. He really had a bright future ahead of him. Yang really enjoyed gambling. He was a very big gambler. He'd go to casinos quite often. He always gambled within his means, though. He was never irresponsible in that respect. Even though he had the money to gamble, he never went above and beyond.
So Ming Jiang was in a very different situation to Yang Lu. Ming Jiang was originally from China. He moved over to the UK. He lived in the Beswick area in North Manchester. He rented that flat. At the time of the murder, he really was in serious debt problems. He'd spent quite a long time at casinos. He was a regular gambler. In fact, so much so that he had VIP status.
We believe that they met in a casino when they share the same interest to gamble. They met in a Manchester casino.
But Yang Lu could never have imagined that their relationship could be so deadly.
Ming Jiang was very well known in the casino community. In some casinos, he had quite specialised status due to the large amounts of money that he was gambling. Yet in other casinos, He had markers on him due to his erratic and volatile behaviour. It was my understanding that he was a great fun guy to be around when he was winning, but it was a very, very different case when he was losing.
He lost a huge amount of money, and as far as we know, is sort of a £200,000 debt, and he's been chasing by the debtor, the creditor within the community.
It was the Crown's case that Ming Jiang had accrued extensive debts. We had knowledge that he had historically acquired over £270,000 worth of debt within 2 casinos. He was struggling to pay off those debts. We knew that he had pawned some wristwatches for over £15,000 to try and keep the debtors at bay.
Getting more and more desperate to pay off his debts, it appears Ming Jiang hatched an evil plan.
Ming Jiang was in huge amounts of debt. He had no income or wherewithal with which to repay that debt, and the only way he believed he could do that was either through his addiction of gambling and waiting for the big win, or through extreme measures. He used the alternative of planning the murder of his friend.
When the police found Ming Jiang, he was actually in possession of Mr. Yang Lu's passport and his bank cards. So at this point, it's safe to assume that he was trying to assume his identity.
So Ming Jiang had taken Yang Lu's life and then he took his identity. He basically used all his personal information in order to extract money through his bank cards. He even tried to sell his flat, and he was making good progress on that at the point at which he'd been arrested. There was nothing that he wouldn't do in order to extract as much money and value out of Yang Lu.
In Manchester, Ming Jiang's trial for the murder of Yang Lu begins.
So the trial was conducted in April of 2017. Shortly prior to the trial hearing, we did meet with the victims' parents, and we had to reassure them that we would do our utmost to be able to obtain justice for their son.
The court hears how Ming Jiang had a checkered history.
Ming Jiang was a Hong Kong national. Before he came to the UK, he was working as cabin crew for a German airline, where he was actually convicted for credit card fraud.
The police found that he had convictions in Germany for shoplifting, convictions for identity fraud and forgery of documents in Switzerland. He had convictions for credit card fraud in Scotland. So as a result of that, as the reviewing lawyer, it was my job then to write international letters of request. I had to make formal requests to Germany and Switzerland to obtain evidence of those convictions, which we then subsequently at the trial hearing submitted as evidence of bad character.
The prosecution believes Ming Jiang was planning to use his experience of identity fraud to build a new life for himself.
It appeared quite clearly that Ming Jiang understood his way around the financial system, and the kind of things that he did and the way that he adopted the identity, for example, by using Yang Lu's phone to contact banks, etc. That showed quite a little bit of knowledge of how to basically defraud and use identity theft to his advantage.
This was premeditated, it was planned. He had devised a plan as to how he was going to assume his victim's identity and obtain all of his assets and walk away. He was probably going to walk away from his debts, take what money he could get from his victim and return to China. I believe that would have been his plan.
The motive behind the murder was quite clearly greed. It was obvious that Ming Jiang understood that Yang Lu had a lot of money. He lived in a nice area of Manchester. He owned his own flat. He dabbled in stocks and shares, and the concept that they'd had together, we believe that there would have been some understanding from Ming Jiang's point of view that Yang Lu was pretty wealthy.
During the trial, Ming Jiang's story changes several times.
Ming Jiang showed no remorse whatsoever throughout the whole process. He came out with bizarre and incredulous accounts, changing the overall story on a number of occasions. Initially, he claimed that Yang Lu was an escort and that they were in a relationship. There was absolutely no evidence to support that.
So he wasn't consistent in his account that he was providing to the police. He did pursue that through to the trial hearing and maintained that it was a different Chinese male called Mr. Wong who had committed the act of murder, and he tried to distance himself by using this fictional character.
He later on claimed that there was a kind of third-party gangster-type individual who was involved that Yang Lu owed money to. Again, from an investigation point of view, we were able to show that that simply wasn't the case.
Ming Jiang fabricated Mr. Wong, and he gave the phone number to the police. However, when the police checked the record of the phone, and it's find out that the phone number is only created a date before they believed Liu Yong died.
So all the explanations that Ming Jiang provided were easily discounted and showed that he was just making things up as he went along.
The jury is shown CCTV from the night police believe Yang Lu was murdered, in a bid to prove that Ming Jiang was the last to see him.
The evidence we used, we had a digital sequence of events that displayed all of the CCTV footage and the appropriate stills. So we had the stills showing that Ming Jiang was friends with the victim and that they had attended the casino together on the 3rd of October. And then subsequently, Ming Jiang had clearly lured him to his flat on the 5th of October, and we had a still digital photo of Yang Lu leaving the Metrolink tram stop at Velo Park, which was the closest one to Ming Jiang's home address.
From a CCTV point of view, that was the last point at which Yang Lu had been seen, so that was on the 5th of October.
So his movements shortly after the time that we believe that he had killed Yang Lu, he used the bank cards that he'd acquired. He used them at B&Q to purchase cleaning products, paint with which to paint the flat. He went to the petrol station on numerous occasions, and he was seen to be filling one, if not two, containers of petrol, which we then subsequently believe that he used to set the body on fire.
Having killed his supposed friend and made attempts to clean the evidence, it appears Ming Jiang goes back to doing what he loves best.
In the early hours of the 6th of October, Ming Jiang spent 30 minutes at the casino. He also spent time at the casino after the deposition. So in the early hours of the 10th of October, he spent around 4 hours. And if you can imagine, he's literally just taken the torso of the body, he's dumped it up in Tinswhistle, and then he set it on fire, returned back to his flat, and the first thing he does is head to the casino to spend Yang Lu's money and gamble.
His actions aren't the actions of what you would expect a normal person to do. And it's a terrible thing to murder somebody. But then to murder somebody and dismember the body and then dump it and set on fire, it's just an incredibly callous act. And it probably speaks a lot about his character.
After hearing the evidence, the jury retires to consider its verdict.
So the jury in this case sat for 4 weeks, and under normal circumstances, you generally expect around about a day days deliberation per week. So under normal circumstances, it would take 4 days to come to a decision. But in this case, it only took them 4 hours, and that shows you really how overwhelming the evidence was.
After weeks of evidence is a very short period of time, and I believe would demonstrate that they were absolutely sure in a very short space of time that Ming Jiang was guilty of this offence.
At the point that they gave their verdict, Ming Jiang was completely emotionless. He showed nothing at all. At that point, he went back into custody and sentencing took place a week later. The judge actually sentenced him in his absence because he refused to come to court.
The presiding judge made a point of stating that the starting point for a sentence would be 30 years due to it being solely the sole purpose being for gain, and in this case for money. However, he outlined aggravating features such as the extensive dismemberment of the body, the complete lack of remorse, and the misleading of evidence. And he made a point of saying that it might be that the authorities never deem him to be safe to be returned to the community, and that he could spend the rest of his life in prison.
On the 2nd of May, 2017, Ming Jiang is sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 33 years. He has never revealed the whereabouts of Yang Lu's limbs or head.
The saddest thing about this murder is Ming Jiang's greed caused the loss of the life of a young 36-year-old man, leaving behind two very grief-stricken, distraught parents.
His family didn't know the last time they spoke to him on the phone, the last time they saw him in person was going to be the last time. I think, yeah, it's really devastating that they never got to say goodbye to their only son.
The killing of a grandmother, a mother and her two daughters sparked the biggest investigation Wales has ever seen, leading to 3 suspects within the police. The chilling Murder in the Valleys continues new Wednesday at 9.
Is it the building that's on fire?
It is, yeah.
It is, okay then.
I got out, I managed to get out.
Right then. It's okay, is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
Right, is he able to get out of the building?
No, because there's fires near the door.
When the call came in, it seemed an unlikely town and an unlikely venue for this sort of thing to happen. At a joinery shop, after tea, when you wouldn't expect people to be working, things just didn't seem quite right.
Everybody was really quite worried. You know, it could have been the person that you walked past in the street, it could have been anybody.
I don't know how anybody could live with it, knowing that they burnt somebody alive.
Everybody was so shocked and everybody was locking up more and feeling a bit worried about it all because nothing like this had ever happened in the village.
A few miles from the bustling seaside resort of Skegness sits the small, picturesque market town of Burgh-le-Marsh, affectionately known by its residents as the Village.
Everybody here calls it a village because we feel like village people. We're so connected and so we help one another.
Burgh-le-Marsh is a typical Lincolnshire village on the edge of the Lincolnshire Wolds, famous for its windmill, where people are hard-working and just get on with their lives.
I've had a salon in Burgh-le-Marsh for 14, 15 years, and it's a lovely, quiet village where everybody knows everybody. Everybody gets on with everybody, and my clients are lovely.
But the peaceful tranquility of the village is about to go up in flames.
we've just gone up to the workshop to pick some things out.
Yeah.
And somebody came up with us behind.
Yeah.
And they attacked us and set fire to the place.
The workshop on fire belongs to well-known local couple David Twigg and Julie Dixon, who own a joinery business next to their home. As the emergency call comes in, Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue Station Commander Gary Milson is immediately dispatched to the scene.
Once I received the call, I'd be straight into my car and making headway down to Burwell Marsh. It's only a few miles down the road. There's not a lot of time to mull over things and get other information in. The information that was relayed to me at that point was that two men dressed in black and wearing balaclavas had accosted David Twigg and his partner. They'd locked David into the storeroom and then proceeded to pour petrol into the foyer of the building and lit it before fleeing the scene. As I approached the premise, there was a white picket fence surrounding it. It seemed quite surreal, the appliances at the bottom with the lights on. As I walked past that towards the entrance where the activity was taking place, the incident commander gave me a quick brief and said that there was very little fire and the fire was out, and they was now trying to locate David Twigg, who they'd been informed was locked in a room inside the building.
With the blaze having been brought under control and extinguished, Gary and his team desperately tried to locate David Twigg.
The workshops were an old railway buildings. They were long and thin, and at the end there was a small area with a kitchen, a storeroom and a toilet and a small foyer that linked these all together. And they were all involved in the fire. They was all black and heated and sooty, but they were all empty apart from the storeroom door that was locked. There was no keys present. The decision was made that the wall might be easier to break through than the door, and a hole was made in the wall, and we could see that there was somebody who appeared to be on the knees facing the door. We tried to rouse them through shouting and speaking to them, but there was no response.
With David not responding, the urgency to reach him grows and the fire crew break deeper into the wall, releasing the door.
As the door opened, David Twigg fell forward into our arms and forward onto the floor. The crews immediately turned him over and began resuscitation. We had an ambulance already in attendance and the paramedics were very quickly there, and we assisted the paramedics in placing him into the ambulance where they could work on him further.
In the back of the ambulance, paramedics battle to resuscitate David Twigg.
The time frame from the call to us getting David out of the cupboard may have been around about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we worked on him for probably another 15-20 minutes after that before the paramedics decided to call time and pronounce him dead.
With David dead, the situation immediately changes. And a murder investigation is launched.
The first information I got was that there'd been a fire at a business premises near Skegness in Lincolnshire, of course, and that two men had been involved. They'd made off, where they hadn't been found at the moment. A man had tragically died, believed to be the owner of the business, and his partner, who worked with him, a lady, had been quite badly injured in the incident. She was being taken to hospital to be treated, and officers were at the scene. So lots of things going through your mind, but at no stage anything other than, this is a murder case, it's tragic, David Twigg has died, and we need to find these two people as soon as possible.
With fire crews, police and paramedics at the scene, it isn't long before news of the tragedy spreads around the town.
It was a big event for Lincolnshire. A robbery homicide in a small village like Burwell Marsh is something that had never happened before in my 25 years covering the area, and it may well never happen again.
Rumours I heard was they was looking for two men, and my house faces a back field, and of course the drones was going over there, there was quite some noise, and I couldn't believe it, actually.
The whole village was stunned that something could have happened on the doorsteps.
It was big news, and everybody was really quite worried that whoever did it could have been out there and they could have been next. You just don't know.
There was a lot of anxiety in the community. Borough Marsh is a long way from the nearest police station, a long way sometimes from the nearest police officer, and local people were obviously very concerned that they may be the victim of a similar burglary.
In the Lincolnshire town of Borough-le-Marsh, police have launched a murder investigation after local joiner David Twigg was pronounced dead following a fire at his workshop. His partner, Julie Dixon, had managed to escape and call 999, reporting that masked intruders had broken in, locked David in the storeroom, and set the place on fire.
The impact on the local community after this happened was immense. It's the only way I can describe it. I was clearly getting phone calls. The local community officers were being stopped in the street. People were going to the police station. There was a kind of sense of not just why has this happened, but who's responsible, and just as importantly, is it going to happen again? Is somebody else going to be, the target of these two individuals? And nobody could think of a reason why David and Julie would be targeted.
David Twigg was an only son. He grew up in the area. His parents remained in the area. He was a master joiner, very popular and a hard-working man in the local area. He was also a very big man, well over 6 feet tall and 19 stone, but he was a presence in the community.
David met Julie in 1996 when she was going through a divorce. The pair quickly moved in together.
They remained together for 15 years. They came across as a typical middle-aged couple. In Borough-le-Marsh, David and Julie were seen as a team. David was the carpenter, the joiner at the business, and Julie was doing the finance and the accounts for the business.
Outside of joinery, David soon discovered a new hobby, stock car racing, which opened up a whole new social circle for him and Julie, with professional racer John Mickle and his wife Lisa.
So from that very first race meeting, really kind of just kicked it off. We enjoyed each other's company. They wanted to come to every single race meeting. They wanted to be involved.
And David soon found a way to combine work with his newfound love when he set up a sideline alongside his joinery company.
As David's business grew, he was quite happy to sponsor the motor racing team. That was one of his passions, and so they undertook that deal, which was several £1,000s.
Julie and David were keen to promote this new Kitchen Bits and Bobs business, which is an online business that they were trying to get off the ground. I think they felt that probably some branding on the race cars, and then obviously we can promote it through social media as well.
The sponsorship proved very successful. David particularly got on very well with the racing team, and they were invited over to America to watch the team racing, and all seemed well. It was a very happy relationship, and he got on very well with them.
I think from the beam on his face when we first, agreed at Liddon Hill, he just seemed incredibly proud. He seemed very smiley. You could tell he was passionate about his business, and this was something that he felt was going to enhance the people that would see his work.
The friendship between the two couples started to grow stronger.
I think from the very first time we met them, I really, really liked what they brought to the team and, the energy. And we call it a race family, and it just felt like they were going to become part of our race family. Julie wanted to be hands-on with me in the kitchen, while David was very quick to throw himself into the deep end with John on the mechanic side as well. They just got stuck in. It wasn't just about the racing anymore. They started to get quite involved. She wanted to be involved in the family life that we had as well. She would buy presents for my children, who were aged 4 and 7 then. You know, they looked fondly upon her and David as well. So they became family friends.
And it was Lisa Julie turned to in the aftermath of the tragedy of David's death.
The very first time I heard about David was on Monday morning. I had a phone call somewhere between 7 and 7:30 in the morning from Julie. She basically was hysterical. She was shouting down the phone, "He's dead, he's dead." And I really didn't have a clue what she was even talking about. I didn't know who's dead. I said, "Julie, who's dead?" She said, David's dead. And I then tried to get some more information. You know, what's happened? She said, a fire. So none of her sentences were very long. It was just words being thrown out at me. I said, a fire? What, there's a house fire? She said, no, workshop, fire, masked men, attacked. From that phone call, I immediately knew I had to go and visit her straight away. I knew it would be a long journey up to Lincolnshire, probably 4 hours. I just grabbed my purse, my keys, and left. So the 4 hours going there was, it's a very weird and surreal situation. You keep thinking, you know, has this really happened? Is this some kind of, you know, is this true? Is it real? I just can't get my head around it. It's an awful lot of information. Hearing her so upset on the phone. And those words, he's dead, they just kept playing and playing in my head.
When Lisa arrives at Julie's parents' house, she finds Julie in a state of shock.
Julie was sitting and rocking in a chair. I was absolutely taken back when I first saw her because she had burns on her face. She told me that her and David, on the Sunday, had gone down to the yard, which is just a short stroll from the house, to lock up. That's all they were doing. They were going to lock up. She said that she had asked David to go into the storeroom to get a light bulb. And these 2 men wearing balaclavas, dressed in black and hoodies, had come into the barn, had locked David in the cupboard, and then had grabbed her. And that they had tried and forced her towards this circular saw. I asked her how she got away, and she said, I just squirmed out of, she said, lucky I was wearing a hoodie. I squirmed out of it and ran. She said she ran out of the door, she ran across the field, and then I think after a short space of time, she turned round to look back to see that these intruders were also leaving the premises and that they'd shut the door behind them. She was then concerned about David, so she went back to the barn. And when she opened the door, suddenly the combustion, the flames, that's what had caused the burns to her face.
While Lisa consoles her heartbroken friend, police turn up to interview Julie as a key witness to the crime.
She was only able to give some basic details. We didn't want to push too hard, of course. She's a victim, she's lost David in the most awful circumstances. Clearly the 999 call provided us with a little bit of information, which was helpful, but we wanted to try and dig deeper if we could, so we had to ask those difficult questions as early as possible. She was interviewed by specially trained officers, but sometimes it just wasn't possible to continue with interviews because Julie wasn't in a emotionally fit state to carry on at that point. So we had to do lots of short sections rather than a really long and draining and demanding interview.
With little information gleaned from Julie and unease growing among the locals, police turned to the public for help.
In the hours that followed, Lincolnshire Police made appeals for the intruders and did reveal that a 999 call had been made by Julie Dixon and gave the description of these 2 masked men who had been to the workshop, and that Julie had managed to push one of them away and escape and then rang the fire brigade on 999.
I remember holding more than one press conference, which wasn't just local and regional, it was national as well, because this was big news in terms of what had happened and where it had happened and the type of community that it was affecting.
As Lincolnshire Police continued to make these appeals, we would take that information and circulate it amongst the various radio stations, local newspapers, daily newspapers in Lincolnshire. And the police were obviously very anxious to get that message out as wide as possible.
With Lincolnshire Police desperately trying to piece together the events of the night and establish the identity of the masked men, Fire Commander Gary Milson scours the crime scene for clues.
Once the fire's been extinguished, we then start on the scene preservation side of it. And as we withdraw from the building, we're trying to make sure that anything that has been removed out of the building is logged or is placed back into the building with care, so that should we need to, we can rebuild that picture, that jigsaw puzzle, to help us find out how the fire started.
I've dealt with quite a few fires, and unfortunately fatal fires as well, and murder cases, and it's probably one of the most challenging cases that you have to deal with, because by its very nature, fire destroys, and fire destroys evidence, not just the fire itself, but the water that's used.
Having established petrol was used as the accelerant, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon begins trying to make sense of the scene.
All police officers and detectives are constantly reminded about how important the golden hour is. It's a time where you can lose evidence, but if you get it right and you gather the evidence and secure and preserve that evidence, it can have a positive impact on the rest of the investigation. The golden hour in this particular investigation was kind of twofold. One was about securing the workshop to make sure that we could get access to it and that nobody else used it, and it could be forensically examined over a period of days, which it was. Also, from a financial point of view, it wasn't going to be a kind of random attack. That is something that I almost eliminated from a very early stage, simply because of where it is. So was it a customer that had been in before? And then you start to think about the reasons why. Is it financial? Is it a robbery or a burglary that's gone wrong? Did David owe somebody some money and they were trying to recover the money? So we drafted in a financial investigator working with the police, and he was starting to look at the actual basics of the business, how it was doing financially, what was going on.
Could David have been targeted for money? Was it a revenge attack for a business deal gone wrong? Or something closer to home?
So Julie did actually send me a few messages, and she called me quite distressed, probably a couple of weeks before David was killed. She did say that her telephone had been cut off, but then was restored again. She said that her electricity had been cut off, but restored again. She felt that someone was messing around with them.
Aware that this information could be key to the investigation, Lisa contacts the police.
So we had what are known as a POLSA team, Police Search Advisor team, specialist search officers that did a kind of fingertip search in the parameters around the building. And actually they found something which appeared quite significant. Deposited in some bushes on a neighbouring piece of land next to the joinery workshop, they found some keys, and we were able to establish at a slightly later point that one of those keys fitted the storeroom that David had been locked inside. So this is quite a significant find for us. Obviously those items were forensically examined, they didn't yield any evidence, but the finding of those keys supported at that point the account that Julie Dixon had given, because they were found in the direction that the two offenders were alleged to have gone off in.
Further inquiries begin to yield some surprising discoveries.
I think the first kind of breakthrough in terms of new information for the investigation wasn't, surprisingly, to do with the two offenders. It was to do with the financial affairs, if you like. We'd been led to believe by the inquiries that we conducted that the business was in a good place financially, that David was doing well, and that the accounts were healthy. In actual fact, when we had a financial investigator start to look more closely at the accounts and the business, the opposite was true. They were in dire financial straits, on the verge, if not already, bankrupt, and there was some serious financial issues.
Having been unaware of the financial issues at David's business, further inquiries throw up more concerns.
The post that was going to the business was supposed to be going to David Twigg Joinery, was actually had been redirected to this garage, and that was quite a big point for us as well, because then that begs the question, well, why is the post being redirected, who's redirecting it, and what lies behind that?
In Lincolnshire, the investigation into the murder of David Twigg has thrown up some suspicious activity around his business.
It soon became clear that both the workshop and the bungalow where they lived had been remortgaged.
Finances were becoming a little bit more of a priority line of inquiry, and we needed also to know why the post was being redirected to another address. We were still keeping an open mind. Obviously, we were still trying to establish these two master offenders, who they were, where they were, why they'd done what they did. But also these other things were starting to kind of build up in terms of the finances, first and foremost, very, very different to how we'd initially thought they were.
While the investigation homes in on David's financial affairs and whether his death could be linked to a business deal, 2 months after his murder, David's body is released so he can finally be laid to rest. Friend Lisa accompanies David's partner Julie to the funeral.
That was a huge, big turning point for us. Suddenly my gut feeling started to take over. The funeral, she acted very strange for someone that was basically saying the last goodbye to a partner. She would crack jokes, and quite inappropriate jokes, acting slightly inappropriately towards people. She was laughing very, very loud. Then suddenly she'd be upset. It just seemed really irrational. And I felt uncomfortable.
But it isn't just friends who have their concerns. Having uncovered some financial irregularities surrounding David and Julie's business, Lincolnshire Police have more questions.
Yeah, we were looking for answers to these questions, and the only person that really could probably provide them was Julie Dixon. I was conscious that we were asking her a lot of questions and being quite direct with her, when actually, on the face of it, she was a victim of the most awful circumstances. But we had to ask those questions. We weren't always given the answers that we were looking for.
As well as the finances, police inquiries with David's creditors flag up something else.
All the inquiries that we carried out with the businesses and the authorities that were dealing with this financial debt, nobody had ever spoken personally or otherwise with David Twigg. Every kind of communication, be it on the telephone, email, that sort of thing, was with Julie Dixon. And what we also uncovered, which was really quite concerning, was that people were being told by Julie that David was terminally ill, that he was abroad on holiday, that he was really unable to take any calls for various different reasons. And this concerned us because we couldn't corroborate this in any way.
Having also discovered the post addressed to David's business was being redirected to a local garage, Stuart and his team trawl through the garage's CCTV, hoping it will reveal who is behind the redirection. Instead, they find another clue.
And when we examined that CCTV, we found that Julie had driven there in a vehicle on the morning of the murder and had filled up petrol cans with petrol at the location. And when we did challenge her with finding that information in the CCTV footage, she told us, yes, I did go to the garage that morning. We were doing some gardening and I needed to get some petrol to fill the lawnmower up. We established also that Julie had a BlackBerry-type mobile phone, and as part of a murder investigation, you're always looking at mobile phone data because it can tell you a lot of things, and we couldn't get into it. So clearly we asked Julie on more than one occasion, could you please help us and tell us what the PIN number is so we can access this device? She was unable to do so. She said that she'd forgotten, she couldn't remember it. Clearly she had been using it very recently and on the day of the murder. We had evidence of that. If nobody else uses it and nobody else has changed the PIN or password, then she must know that number or that code. What's in that BlackBerry? Why won't she tell us the PIN number? We really desperately needed to get to the bottom of what had happened, and this was the point where the investigation focus really changed.
As the months tick by, friends of Julie also start to have their doubts as to what really occurred that fateful night.
One race meeting that I remember very, very clearly was the last race meeting that she's ever come to. When we arrived there was a police car there. She started screaming and hitting things, shouting at the top of her voice, making some very loud noises. And I just said, Julie, talk to me. What's wrong? Why are you upset? She sat, she rocked, she cried. She rocked, she cried. And then she started saying, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And I just said, what are you sorry for? Tell me what you're sorry for. She rocked, she cried, I'm sorry. And it was like a repeated process. She said nothing else, she did nothing else.
While Julie spends a weekend away with friends, back at the investigation, forensic evidence starts to build up.
Now, the account Julie gave was that the two men had come in, there'd been a tussle, she'd managed to get out of the place, and she'd gone to ring 999, and then she'd noticed them running out, the two offenders, and they ran off round the back, and she went back in to try and rescue David or find him, and as she opened the door, there was a flashback, and she was hit with the fumes from the fire and the explosion. And that was how she got the injuries. Actually, forensic evidence would say otherwise, and would indicate that it was what's known as a vapour cloud.
When the petrol would be originally poured into the foyer and lit, as the petrol's ignited, the vapour cloud would ignite first, and anybody in that vicinity would get caught in that vapour cloud, and depending on the amount of vapour and the intensity of it, they may just get slight singeing and flash burns, or they could indeed get quite badly burnt. That seemed to be fitting more with the burns to Julie Dixon than rather what she was telling us, that she would open the door and it had flared up. In fact, we considered it quite unlikely that she had opened the door and the petrol had flared up like that. Once it's lit, it's done that initial flare up, and it's unlikely that would happen again. There was a petrol can behind the door. Had she have opened the door right at the start of the fire, she would have moved the petrol can, so that evidence didn't add up.
We also recovered from a forensic examination of the bungalow some very small hairs in the bathroom sink. Now, again, on the surface, first viewing, not particularly relevant, but when we have those sent off to be forensically examined and we find out that they belong to Julie Dixon, those hairs, again, not particularly relevant, it's her bathroom, she uses the bathroom, there are going to be hairs. They were identified as eyelash or eyebrow hairs, but they were singed, they were burned. That put a kind of different slant on it as well.
Finding burned eyebrow hairs revealed Julie had gone into the bathroom after the fire had started, knowing full well her partner was trapped inside a burning building, something which raises suspicion among the police. Not only that, but the fire investigators believe Julie could only have received her injuries if she'd been inside the building when the fire started.
Julie Dixon had given various different accounts. She'd given us very little information. The more we tried to put to her by way of questions, the more withdrawn she'd become at that point, and actually became quite defensive at various times as well. And it was at that point that I made the decision, based on all the anomalies and the significant findings, she was going to be arrested on suspicion of the murder of her partner, David.
Three months after David's death, and news of Julie's arrest soon spreads around her hometown.
Obviously, there had been a lot of anxiety and fright in the community about intruders being at large. So in some ways, the arrest of Julie put that to bed. But equally, there was also some anger that obviously they'd spent 3 months believing Julie's story.
There was a lot of upset people. She had upset a lot of people because she befriended Well, she was everybody's friend. She was a very likeable person. And, yeah, it was a big shock to everybody.
Julie Dixon is brought into the police station for formal questioning, this time as a suspect, not as a witness.
I was prepared, I thought, for most things to come from that interview, including a no-comment interview, which is quite common. So we'd gathered together as a group, the interviewing officers, the SO, the interview coordinator, to discuss what could happen. But what actually did happen, I think it's fair to say, threw us all at that point. She provided a prepared statement, and what it said in a nutshell was that this whole situation had been a suicide pact. So what she said was that both her and David had wanted to die due to the dire financial circumstances around the business and personal issues, and that they were preparing to do just that, but that when the crunch came to lighting the petrol and setting the fire, she panicked and ran out of the building, leaving David behind.
In Lincolnshire, police are questioning David Twigg's partner on suspicion of his murder.
My initial thoughts were that if Julie was prepared to lie about two masked raiders and invent a story around what had actually happened, then what else had she lied about?
In interview, Julie claims the fire was a joint suicide pact, but that she had panicked and fled. So police need to establish if there is any truth in her account.
Let's go back and speak to friends and family. What sort of state of mind was David in? And actually, fairly quickly, it was established that he was in a good state of mind. He had no idea, we think, that the business was in such dire straits. He had no reason to die.
There's no way that David in his right mind would do a suicide pact, because he loved life too much and he was enjoying it too much. You know, the weeks before he got killed, he was down with us, enjoying it, planning the next year, the next trips, where we were going. He would never had that in his back of his mind. So we knew for ourselves then that she was bonkers and she had done it, and she was now trying to get herself out of a murder.
Suddenly, here we are. It's now a suicide pact. And who has a suicide pact but's locked behind a door that they don't have the key to? So they couldn't even change their mind if they wanted to. Poor David died on his hands and knees in a praying position, leaning against a door that was locked from the outside. That's not a suicide pact.
With time running out to hold Julie Dixon without charge, Senior Investigating Officer Stuart Gibbon consults with the Crown Prosecution Service.
So we clearly were very concerned about this prepared statement and just felt that it was probably another way of shifting focus. You know, we've had the masked defenders, they no longer exist now, so now we're going to go down the suicide pact, which is, interestingly enough, is a partial defence to murder, and if found to be true, could result in a conviction for manslaughter rather than murder. So that kind of made sense at that point. We had CPS working with us, so we could talk to them about the content of that prepared statement. They were already fully au fait with the evidence that we gathered that far. And the CPS lawyer was happy at that point that there was sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect for conviction. So the decision was made to charge Julie Dixon with murdering her partner, David Twigg.
With Dixon charged with murder, police and CPS prepare for trial, and part of that means trying to establish a motive. Why would Julie want David dead?
The main strands of evidence, really, I mean, there were quite a few bits of circumstantial as well, the petrol and the redirection of the post, but the main ones were really the finances. You know, we found out that they were in dire straits. What I think is that it was getting to the point where a warrant was issued for non-payment of fines. The bailiffs were going to turn up at the workshop at some point. That is the stage where David would become aware of the scale of this debt, in fact the debt existed at all maybe, and Julie Dixon could then hold that back no longer. That was where it was all going to come to a head.
As well as discovering the couple were in serious financial trouble, police now had CCTV proving Julie purchased petrol on the day of the murder. But it's forensic evidence of a computer found in the couple's workshop which really helps build the case for the prosecution.
We'd heard stories that she'd been Googling stuff on a laptop, claiming that David had been Googling stuff. How do you commit suicide with it being undetected?
She was Googling on her laptop how to poison someone with cakes and how to get away with murder.
As the trial approaches, Julie Dixon changes her story yet again.
Things kind of changed a little bit again when Julie Dixon then started to say that it wasn't a suicide pact. Actually, David did want to die, and she was just trying to help him along, basically. So she's trying to remove herself even further from any kind of blame whatsoever. You know, it was David's idea. David wanted to do it. I just kind of helped him. Things had changed hugely since the first 999 call to the emergency services, but we felt we had a strong case. On the second day of that hearing, the not guilty plea, which had been entered initially by Julie Dixon, changed to a guilty plea, but she still maintained at that point that this had been all about David wanting to die. That's what the defence was putting forward, whereas our defence was cold-blooded, premeditated, pre-planned murder.
With Julie's shocking confession, the trial is halted.
Once Julie Dixon had admitted her guilt and pleaded guilty to David's murder, the role of the jury was no longer needed, but then falls to the judge to decide on what basis he believes her plea and on what basis the killing was carried out. So this is what is called a Newton hearing, and the judge hears evidence from all the parties in the case, and it's in the judge's role to decide how the murder was carried out effectively.
The prosecution lays out its case to the judge, and Julie's 999 call is played to the court.
They captured and set fire to the place.
So the place that she set fire?
Yeah.
Is it the building that's on fire?
It is, yeah.
It is, okay then.
I got out. I managed to get
Right then. It's okay. Is everybody out of the building?
No, there's still my partner in.
The phone call, on the face of it, sounded very genuine. She sounded distraught. She was hysterical. But actually, the first information imparted was more of an account about what they'd been doing, like a rehearsal, rather than just saying, I need help and I need help quickly.
Over 5 days, the court hears how Julie's account changed throughout the investigation. From masked intruders to a joint suicide pact, to her assisting David in his own bid to take his own life.
The defence argued, once Julie Dixon had pleaded guilty, that matters had spiralled out of control and that in some ways this had been an emotional response from Julie Dixon, almost that she had panicked because of the financial difficulties she got into. However, I think from the prosecution's point of view, and certainly from the police point of view, this was a perpetrator who had changed her accounts whenever it had suited her, whenever she had been confronted with new evidence. There was always a line of defence. So it's hard not to see her really as a very skillful and manipulative liar.
Julie Dixon didn't take the stand at all, didn't give evidence, was again very impassive, didn't present any emotion at any stage of the court proceedings, merely sat in the dock and appeared to be listening to the proceedings.
The extent of the couple's financial difficulties is revealed to the judge.
David wouldn't have had a clue about that bankruptcy. He was quite happy going about his everyday business. I think if he had found out that he had been declared bankrupt, he would have been incredibly upset, being such a proud man. So, yeah, she obviously kept that from him. And I can't see that those finances would have been enough for anyone to lose their life over.
At the end of that hearing, Judge Heath had to decide whose account he believed. And he came firmly down on David Twigg's side and said that he in no way believed that David Twigg had wanted to commit suicide. And he described Julie Dixon's account as a pack of lies.
The judge was quite damning in his comments and quite clear that he thought it was a cold-blooded murder and that, you know, she'd been kind of playing the part, and it was potentially worthy of an Oscar nomination if it hadn't been so sad and so true.
Julie Dixon is sentenced to life with a minimum of 23 years for the murder of David Twigg. 11 years on, he is still remembered fondly.
No sentence can ever bring back a loved one. It will never be enough, of course, and it will never bring David back. But I just hope it brings some little comfort to the loved ones and those who loved David so much.
It just beggars belief that anyone would do that to another human being, a living person, someone you're supposed to care about, your partner. It's just incredibly difficult to understand how anyone would do that.
I think the hardest thing is to wrap your head around is the way she calculated it, how she planned it all. What else was she planning? What else was she thinking? They say it's down to money. We'll never know. Obviously, she don't care about anybody because obviously she did what she did. So no one will ever know what's going through her head.
This investigation and this case impacted hugely on the community and the village of Burla Marsh. You know, people aren't going to forget what happened. It lives with them forever, and whenever the name of the village is sometimes mentioned, people will talk about this case. I know I certainly will never forget it.
When a routine call to a house fire turns into the biggest murder investigation in Welsh history, you know you're in for a chilling ride. New Murder in the Valleys starts Wednesday at 9.
I smiled at her, tall and slender, with long ash blonde hair. I'd never seen her more beautiful. She looked a little like she was from the 60s with her cheap bracelets and denim shirt, though she wasn't a teenager in the 60s yet. A cab pulled up and the driver didn't honk. We hugged and I kissed her cheek. "Thanks for everything, Daddy," she said. "You're welcome, Princess," I said and got in the car. "University?" the driver asked. "Was it that obvious? I've seen a lot in the last few days. Goodbye hugs on Digg Street, taking passengers to the train station. It's that time of year." I thought it was called Digby Street. It is, but most of those big houses have been converted into apartments for students. I've heard that some letters from parents these days are even addressed to Digg Street. I take it you're saying goodbye to your daughter. Yes. So Digg Street is a safe neighborhood? Absolutely. I've never heard of any trouble there. Anyway, they all look out for each other. What university does she attend? At the London College of Music, I said. Good for her. Is she going to be a rock star? Who knows? Can't say I'm against it. Where's your train headed? To Newcastle. Is that a long way to go? Yes. Even with a few stops, it'll take over 6 hours by car and less than 3 by train. Unfortunately, Georgie still gets carsick sometimes. He was a nice man, and I thought he was sincere, not just trying to get a bigger tip, but he got one anyway. I had a lot of time to think on the train. My wife Gwen, who stayed in Newcastle, didn't want to come to London. She had told me this when I bought the tickets. She doesn't like long goodbyes and was more comfortable just seeing us off from home. But I was happy to accompany Georgia. She had always been a daddy's girl, and I wanted us to spend as much time together as possible. The night before, Friday, I had met her roommate Sheila, who seemed quite poised. I collapsed on their couch, which turned out to be surprisingly comfortable. It took both of us to get all her luggage on and off the train. She insisted on bringing her guitar, one of several instruments she knows how to play. I'd like to think she got that talent from me, and so our little bird flew from the nest. But so many 18-year-olds go off to university and don't come home in their 20s. She may meet Mr. Right before she graduates, and many students are picked up by London agents and hired right away. Back home, Gwen and I chatted about her that Saturday night. We both missed her in our own ways. We made love that night, and it was like a healing process. The next morning, Gwen took the dog out for a walk around the common area, her Sunday morning ritual. Gloria is only a mongrel, but very much a mama's girl. We had discussed the possibility of her living in London with Georgie, but decided that she wouldn't want to part with Gwen. Besides, we weren't sure if the London landlord would allow pets. That's just me, Mick. Lived with 3 girls whose names begin with G, and now there are 2 left. I was just pouring coffee when the phone rang. Hi, Dad. Did you have a good trip home? Not too boring? Hi, yourself. Yeah, it was good. Are you ready for the first day tomorrow? Yeah, Sheila and I are both ready. We have classes together. We're going to run over to the Sunday market to get some stuff. Is Mom walking Gloria? Yes. Good. Please don't tell her I called. That sounds intriguing. I forgot something important. What? My rabbit. What, Roger? How could you? I know it was stupid. I meant to pack him last, so he'd be first when I got here, but I forgot. Where is it? Under my pillow, unless Mama moved it. And you don't want her to know? Not really. You know how she used to say all the time, "Do you have everything? Are you sure?" I'd never get over it. Got it. I'll find Roger, put him in my briefcase, and send him off work tomorrow. Thanks, Dad. I went straight to Georgie's room. I have a tendency to forget things. Roger is quite small compared to toy rabbits, and he was lying where she said he would be. A little flattened, but fine. Dropping the pillow back into place, I noticed something in the bed. I lifted the blanket and extracted a hair. Taking it in my hands, I examined it. Mine is short and brown, while Gwen's is medium length and blonde, which is where Georgie got her color from. This one was long, black, and curly. I knew for a fact that Georgie had broken up with her boyfriend from grammar school a month before her last semester at school. She'd grumbled for a couple of days, but soon got over it. They'd never had anything serious, and I was sure they'd never had sex. Anyway, he had russet brown hair, like me. No, the hair in front of me was that of someone Gwen must have dragged into this bed while I slept over in London, and she had the good conscience not to use the marital bed. I only knew one other person with hair like that, Pedro, a young clerk in my office. He had recently moved from Wales, and one night we took him out to dinner to help him settle in. After he left, Gwen remarked how handsome he was. He was 20 years younger than us, but it was obvious that she was attracted to him. He couldn't have had the same effect on Georgie. She was staying with a friend that night. She'd never seen Pedro. He looked like Brian May, the lead guitarist for Queen, and I'd often heard Georgie try to imitate that style of playing, so she'd be sure to mention it if they met. But Gwen had asked how he was doing every week since he'd arrived. On Monday, I did my postal duties and saw Roger off on his way south. I casually asked the receptionist if anything interesting had happened during my brief absence. No, everything had gone smoothly last Friday. Oh, and Pedro had taken the day off, too. He was looking for a place to live. It made sense. He was still living at B&B, and I wondered if he'd found a comfortable place. Soon we were sitting around the coffee machine. Did you manage to find a house for Pedro? Yeah, I got lucky on Friday. The house isn't new, but I like old properties. It's good enough for 6 months until I find something more permanent. Great, said I. By the way, how's your wife doing? Gwen, isn't she? Never better. That's good to hear, he said and went back to his desk. That evening, back home, I got the inevitable question as we ate dinner. Has Pedro settled in? All good. He's found a place to live. Oh, good. Is it close by? I didn't ask. We ate in silence for a while, and Gwen didn't mention him again. Tessa called me at work today, she said. I know Tessa. You met her that Wednesday when you dropped me off at yoga class when my car wouldn't start. She was an instructor, well, she still is. You said she looked like Morticia Adams, played by Angelica Houston. I remember. Long, straight hair, high cheekbones, very attractive. I was tempted to do yoga myself. It wouldn't hurt to stir Gwen up a bit. She ignored him. She wanted to know if I wanted to go to South Shields with her next Saturday. Harvey Nichols is closing, and they're having a final sale. Women's fashion is on the market, right? Yes. We thought we'd make a day of it. You know, bargain hunting. It's only half an hour by train, so we could have lunch at the wine bar. Why not? Have fun. And we thought, well, I was wondering if you could pick us up at the train station. Let me explain. You and this Tessa go shopping for expensive clothes. I stay at home and look after your dog while you spend my hard-earned money. And then I organize a cab service when you're done because you're both too drunk to drive. That's your plan. Exactly. Where does she live? She lives with her father on Morpeth Road. Then we could pick her up on Saturday morning. I'll drive you both to the station. Great! You're the best, Mickey! She always called me Mickey when she got her way. Saturday night, I'll give you the best sex of your life. It would be nice if Tessa did, too. You don't stand a chance with her, you dirty old man. The next day, Pedro knocked on my office door. Can I have a word with you, boss? Sure, come on in. I'm moving to a new place soon. Do you need another day off? No, nothing like that. I'll do it over the weekend and unpack everything over the next few evenings. I was just wondering if you and your wife, Gwen, would like to stop by my place Friday night. I can return the favor and cook dinner for you. You cook? Yes, sort of. We'd be delighted. I'll tell her. Naturally, Gwen was delighted too. The rest of the week went quite normally. On Wednesday night, Gwen went to yoga class as usual, but on Thursday I called her and told her that the power was out at the company. There were important things to finish, and I had to stay until it was turned back on. Of course that was a lie, and after Pedro left work, I called again and told her I wouldn't be home until 10. She, as usual, expressed concern about me eating something, and I told her I would stop by on the way home. I knew she had Pedro's new phone number and gave him an hour to get home and get a call from her. I left work only an hour late, not 5. The house was very quiet when I arrived, and I silently entered the house. Gwen wasn't downstairs, and I heard noises coming from our bedroom. This time it wasn't from Georgie's room. She had either become confident or careless. I crept up and listened outside the door. She let out a high-pitched scream, and I swung the door open and burst inside. "Jesus, you scared me!" she screamed. I looked around. Gwen was squatting on the floor in just her underwear. In front of her, also on the floor, was the bottom drawer of her dresser. We both spoke at the same time. I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "What are you doing home this early?" I backed away. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. The electricity was back on and we finished early." "Well, you're just in time. That deep drawer slipped out while I was checking it. It's too heavy for me to put it back in place. But if you do, I won't have to take everything out." While she put her robe on, I put it back away. Downstairs, she was heating up a beef stew. "So what was so important in that drawer?" I asked. "That you had to strip down to your underwear to find things?" Gwen looked at me perplexed. "I told you, we're going shopping on Saturday. I've been trying on some old dresses, checking which ones don't fit or are out of fashion so I can buy a couple of new ones. And in that drawer are all my scarves, gloves, and handbags. While I'm at the sale, we can stock up for next year. I may not get that opportunity again." I felt a little silly, but I hoped it didn't show. Without embarrassment, I watched them closely on Friday night. I must admit that Pedro did a great job with dinner. We had salmon steaks with steamed vegetables and a wonderful homemade creamy dressing. "This is just delicious," Gwen exclaimed. "You can invite me back again." "Thank you, you're welcome any time." I wondered if she really meant you can invite me again, and I wondered if he meant we were both welcome, or just Gwen. Under the pretense of a glass of water, I checked his kitchen basket. No sign of prepared food or takeout, just a box of cherry cheesecake from Sara Lee. He'd made it all himself. "Anyone want dessert? It's cheesecake," he asked. He brought it over and put it into 3 servings. "Ah, you didn't make it," I accused him, smiling. "It's Sara Lee." "My bad," he admitted. As befits victories go, it was pathetic. We retired to his living room and he turned on some romantic music. He and Gwen finished their white wine. I stopped at 2 glasses as I drove. Neither of them offered to dance. The only contact was when Gwen slapped his thigh. "Well, we have to leave, Pedro. We have to get up early tomorrow." "Going somewhere?" he asked. "Shopping in South Shields," she replied, leaving her hand where it was. Well, have fun, he replied. Her hand gripped his thigh tighter, but it might as well have been an effort of will. In the car, we waved goodbye to each other and he went back inside. I'm cold. Could you turn on the heater? She asked. I need to go out for a minute. I forgot my scarf. She returned and knocked on the door. He opened it and they talked briefly. Then they went inside and the door slammed shut. She appeared half a minute later, just enough time for a goodnight kiss. I couldn't understand why he didn't just hand her the scarf. Surely it was lying right in the hallway. That was great, she said, buckling her seatbelt. What was? Pedro's salmon dinner, of course. What did you think? The next morning, I drove Gwen and Tessa to the train station, as agreed. It was drizzling rain, and they both had their hoods on. It took an earthquake to keep the women away from the sails, after all. When I got home, Gloria came over and sat at my feet. You're not fooling me, Mutt, I told her. You're only interested in me when your mom isn't home. She turned around and stood on her hind legs, trying to climb up next to me. You can't climb up here, you fat lump. I'll pick you up if you tell me what to do next. She made a brrr sound in the back of her throat. Phone! Good idea! I lifted her onto the couch and went to the phone. The stupid bitch jumped down and followed me. I called Pedro. I'd invite him over for a beer. Okay, I doubt he'd go to South Shields either. What would Tessa do while he had Gwen? Or was he sleeping with both of them? No, how could that be? He'd only been in the area for a few weeks. Still, it would be reassuring to keep him in sight, so I called. There was no reply. I turned to Gloria. Any other ideas? I looked around the house for clues. Condoms, soiled panties, new sexy lingerie, but found nothing. Then I called the yoga class. No, Tessa wasn't there today. She'd gone shopping. Well, at least she hadn't snuck back on the next train. Maybe Gwen did. Tessa could have been an accomplice. Gwen buys a couple of items on sale and goes back to Pedro's for her session, leaving Tessa there with the shopping. Should I call Pedro again? Enough! This was getting stupid. All I had was the curly black hair from my daughter's bed. Maybe Georgie had a lover? Maybe she'd met Pedro after all. When I picked them up at the station, the rain had picked up. They were both a little drunk and loaded with shopping, a lot of it. Gwen had bought so much stuff that I wondered how she had time to go to a wine bar, let alone sleep with someone. Later, when she unpacked everything and showed me what she had bought, I found myself paying attention. She certainly found some bargains and didn't spend as much as I had feared, and she splurged on some sexy panties. Now we can be noisier when Georgie is gone, she said. I decided to keep an eye out for when they were worn, but other than that, I gave up. I was clearly on the wrong track. Sunday night, we made love, trying out the see-through French panties. It was one of our best sessions. Monday morning, I quickly checked that the new panties were in the laundry basket. They were stained, my stains. I silently swore to myself that this had to stop. I went into the shower and washed away my suspicions. It worked. At the office, I managed the day's business without even thinking about my curly hair. It was over. At the coffee machine, I overheard the office banter. So, Pedro, one of the girls said, have you had any luck finding female company this weekend? Have you found the right miss yet? She was clearly fishing. No miss right yet, Sarah, but I spent all day Saturday in the pleasant company of a very attractive older lady. Ooh, tell me about it. I wanted to move here because my aunt retired and moved to this part of the country. She's not very confident driving anymore, so I spent the day with her, sorting out closets and weeding the garden and stuff, and then drove home. Now I have her car. Cool. Maybe you could give me a ride sometime. Where does your aunt live? In South Shields. She has a first-floor apartment near a big shopping center. I called Georgie just before I left home. I wanted her to cover for me the next time I spoke to Gwen. I told her I was due to visit her in London the following Friday night, and I was staying with her. What are you really doing, Daddy? She sounded concerned, of course. You know it's your mom's birthday soon. I'm planning a big surprise for her, and it's going to take some preparation. Don't worry, you'll find out soon enough. She agreed, and I told her our story. Georgie called me at work today, I said over dinner. Problems? Not really. She and her roommate have a gig on Friday, not passing the hat at some pub, but performing at an expensive club, and they're getting paid for it. Wow, good for you. Yeah, she called because she's nervous about it. She asked if I could come down and watch. You know, clapping loudly after every song. Why not? It's only a 3-hour train ride. Will you be stopping? Exactly what I thought would be her first question. Yeah, their couch is comfortable enough. I can tear myself away from work this afternoon. Want to go? The big couch? No. We'll have to stay at a nearby hotel. I held my breath. If she wanted to come, the story would get complicated. Canceled gigs and so on. I'd love to. Damn. But it's our busiest time at work right now. I can't take time off. You go. I exhaled. That was the first time I'd ever heard her company had a busy period. Finally, it was Friday. This was my last attempt. I would either catch her red-handed or quit this nonsense. After lunch, I called Gwen and told her I was on my way to the train station. I even parked the car there just in case. Then I took a cab straight home. I couldn't believe she couldn't take time off work, so I waited for her in the little office. She never went in there. I made it just in time. 30 minutes after I took my seat, I heard the front door open. So much for being busy at work. I didn't see her, but I listened at the office door. "Mick!" she called out. I smiled. That's exactly what I would do. Then in her normal voice, she said, "Then let's go straight upstairs. I'll make you dinner later." 2 sets of footsteps went up the stairs, and they went into Georgie's room, right above me. I gave them 10 minutes. As I climbed the stairs, I heard sounds. They were clearly from the realm of sexual pleasure, nothing like the grunts of replacing heavy drawers. So here I was again, same scenario, different door. I swung it open and stepped inside. Gwen was lying naked on Georgie's bed. She was in the classic 69 pose. Her legs pointed toward the ceiling, a mop of curly black hair between her thighs. Her lover raised his head. I had a flashback to the last 2 trips to the station, in raincoats. They scattered, and I saw them both in all their glory. I screamed, "Tessa! You got a perm!"